Welcome to the San Ramon Valley Unified School District's Board of Education Special Workshop. We want to let the public know that we are video recording this meeting. The recording is being live streamed on the district's YouTube channel. So let's start with a call to order. And then we can do attendance. So Rachel.
Hello, I'm Rachel Hurd and I represent Trustee Area 5.
Good evening / afternoon. My name is Jesse Van Zee and I'm trustee representing Area 1.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shelley Clark and I represent Area 2.
I'm Laura Brett and I represent Area 3.
And hi, everyone. I'm Susanna Ordway representing Area 4.
Okay, great. Let's next do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. All right, I'll need an acceptance of the workshop agenda. So can I get a motion?
I'll move to approve.
I'll second.
Agenda.
The motion was made by Board Member Hurd and seconded by Board Member Clark. Roll call vote. Board Member Hurd.
Aye.
Board Member Van Zee.
Aye.
Board Member Clark.
Aye.
Board Member Bratt.
Aye.
Board Member Ordway.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. I have a little disclaimer for our 4.0 board workshop. We wanted to let everyone know that on slide 18 of the presentation, which was in the packet, page 23, if you are viewing in the packet, additional policy considerations, BP 6211.11 supplemental resources was listed incorrectly and should have been listed as BP 6161.11 supplemental resources. BP 6211.11 is not an existing policy number for SRVUSD or CSBA. It's just a clerical mistake. Thank you for understanding. So we will move to 4.1, the selection and use of instructional materials. And it looks like that Superintendent John Malloy and Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction, Debbie Pettish.
Thank you, President Brad. And I'm just going to begin with framing the work that we've done in preparation for today's workshop. And I'm also grateful that Namita Brown is with us to provide legal support should that be needed. And I think that the most important starting point is to comment that our existing process around instructional materials and our policies have always attempted to keep a number of very important partnerships in mind. So first of all, as we all know, we remain focused on our students who we serve every day. And our students have many different interests and they have many different strengths and they have many different passions. And that whole concept that we've been speaking about specifically through our deep learning and innovation commitment of student voice and choice is very much a part of this discussion. Further, we also trust and respect and are thankful for the professional and expert judgment of our staff, our teachers, our librarians, who have very carefully helped us understand how they walk through the process of determining what they would like to use resource-wise, even before it gets to Debbie's team. We're grateful to Debbie and her team, who whenever it comes to anything connected to this topic is usually the focal point at the district office, and considerable work has been done depending upon the time of year. And we also partner with our parents and our caregivers because the process and policy that we are going to hear explicitly about tonight is one that has been in place for a while. And even though I know that in this room, we have experienced tensions around this process, I'm also happy to report that our principals share with us how often they are in discussion with our parents and caregivers on a weekly basis when there are sensitivities around any curriculum and instructional materials. And those are oftentimes worked out and worked on before they ever reach our level. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind that it's not as though it's an either or conversation. It's about the partnerships that drive our process. It's about the partnerships that have always been in place. And when there are challenges, there is policy that speaks to you bring it forward in a certain way all the way to the board. And I think I'm not exaggerating when I say the most recent experience of that process being used is probably the first time in, we can't even remember when. So that has always been in place for many, many years though, and is always available to our community. But to take it a little bit further, because it came up when we were having discussions in previous board meetings, part of what I believe makes this discussion a bit more complex is that when our educators are engaging, especially at the high school level, with 180 kids, there are times when our educators do choose, for very important reason, whole class instruction with resources aligned to it. And then there are times when that individual voice and choice might enter in, and then our staff wants to ensure that there's a wide variety of resources for that choice to be meaningful and real. And so we need to keep in mind as we engage in our part of the discussion and then turn it over to you, that that professional judgment is foundational and one that we expect. And our educators know that we hold that bar very high and we are grateful at the work they do. The next concept that becomes complex is this notion that we hold on to for valid reasons, and I'm not negating it in any way, which is age appropriateness. Our librarians have shared with me, and some are here tonight, and they've helped me understand, because I'm not an expert, that we do refer to the tools that we use, but those tools are not necessarily as clear as we might, those of us who aren't expert, think they would be. And if you use multiple tools, you might see multiple responses. And our expectation is that our educators, our librarians help us navigate that. Our principals are well-trained and well-supported to engage in this conversation as well, which is why I'm grateful to them, because they tend to be the one when there are sensitivities that bubble up over the classroom that do deal with these issues, which is why, as I said earlier, we don't actually see as many cases as we might hear exist. But I think it's also important for us to emphasize that our parents are major partners in this conversation, and that balance and sometimes tension is a healthy one. But I think that from a staff perspective, a cabinet perspective, we're grateful that the present policy provides a little bit of room, because it's not as clear cut as we sometimes talk about it. And I'm conscious of that, because since our public meetings, I've had a lot of opportunity to listen, as I'm sure you have as well. And all that I can take away from those conversations are: one, we want to support our kids to the best possible means. Two, we want to support our staff to be brilliant, as I believe they are. Three, we want to support our parents so that their voice is heard and understood. And four, it's not always neat. And that's just part of the reality that we are in. So I'm framing things that way. Tonight, our goal is to share with you publicly exactly what is our process and policy. Because one of the things I've heard over the last while is some ambiguities, some misunderstandings, and so forth. Secondly, we have legal responsibilities as it relates to the type of inclusive education we are expected to provide. That is another piece we would like to share with you. And we have no other recommendations as a cabinet for you, because we frankly have been working with what has been the direction, and we as a cabinet are fine with that direction. What you will then need to do is to think about if you are interested in any type of different direction. But I need to be really clear that what needs to happen is that you might determine through this conversation that a formal discussion needs to happen, but then that would need to be put on the agenda at the May board meeting so that you could carry on that conversation there, because no action to us can come from here. I think you all know that, but I'm also sharing that for our community, because they may not understand that in workshops, you're having conversation in front of the community, and the community will have an opportunity to offer comment should they like. And then you have to decide if you want to continue that further in a formal fashion. And the way you would continue that further in the formal fashion is either one of you reaches out to President Bratt and says, I'd like it on the agenda, or all of you decide that you want to put it on the agenda in this particular setting. But either way, it needs to go to that agenda if we're going to do anything differently than what presently exists. So I hope that helps you understand what we've been deeply thinking about in preparation for tonight. And without any further comment from me, because really all I wanted to do was the framing, I'm turning it over to the person who actually has a way more closeness to this than I. Debbie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malloy, for framing it. And thank you so much for the Board of Education for giving us this opportunity to talk about this topic. We also really appreciate, I know we did have to reschedule this, so we really appreciate your flexibility with regard to that. So we'll get started here. It's okay. Thank you so much, Logan. Could fix anything. Okay, as we saw last night at Night of the Stars. So Dr. Malloy said it so eloquently. To get a little bit more in depth, really our overview and purpose for today is we wanted to provide you with really a comprehensive review of instructional material selection. So how do we select the instructional materials in SRVUSD, and then how do we use them? And of course, the particular focus tonight is on how we use books or novels. And I really use those terms synonymously for tonight to teach ELA standards across K through 12 classrooms. So we broke it down. Dr. Malloy talked about my part in really emphasizing the what is in terms of what we do. And we've divided it into these 4 parts. So what are our guiding principles for instructional material selection, particularly with regard to books? What is the educational governance? And I'm using that term kind of as an overarching way to discuss all the legalities or the policies and the processes that currently exist that we really need to consider when we select books. And so I'll go over all of those. And then teaching practices and key terms explained. I know in education, and I know especially I have a bad habit of using a lot of acronyms or terms synonymously after being in education for 30 plus years. And so we thought it would be a great opportunity today to really kind of level set and talk through how do we use books in ELA classrooms? What does that really mean? What does that look like? And then, of course, talk about next steps and hear from all of you. But first, I would like to, we're so fortunate to have some special guests here, so I would like to introduce them. First, we have Namita Brown, and she is our attorney from F3 Law Firm, in case she needs to talk about or you need to ask her any questions about the legalities of this. We have Carrie Leadingham. Unfortunately, Kirsten cannot be here this evening, but we have Carrie Leadingham, who is currently a liaison at Monte Vista High School, but she has been a longstanding ELA teacher in our district. And then we have Lauren Dowd and Alicia Martin, who are our teacher librarian leads. In addition to, I see lots of staff members. So thank you everybody for coming and being in attendance here. But we are able to ask any of them questions. If you have questions that I feel like maybe I can't answer, I was not an ELA teacher, I would be more than happy to call them up and they can expound on those topics for you. All right, so our guiding principles, of course, this looks very familiar. I do feel like this discussion really encompasses all 3 of the strategic directions that you see on the left. They're all rolled up into one when we talk about books, right? You have deep learning and innovation. We, of course, have equity, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, and social emotional well-being. So much of what teachers select for students to read in the classroom is not only to support them in learning at high levels, but it's also to create equitable environments where students can see themselves in those books in order to essentially support their social emotional well-being. And then, of course, our learner profile competencies. And all of you, I'm sure, can imagine how important books are to developing all those competencies, but especially, effective communicators, intentional collaborators, critical thinkers, etc. So ultimately, that leads us to these 5 guiding principles that we would like to use to guide this discussion today. And so first is, like everything we do in SRVUSD, we want to align, really need to align our work to the strategic directions and the learner profile that I just highlighted. Of course, also when we talk about this topic, we want to anchor it in legal compliance and board policy. What are our parameters there? What do we absolutely have to do in terms of legalities? And then where do we have a little bit more wiggle room where we can maybe change the boundaries, for example, with regard to board policy? In line with our strategic directions, we want to provide safe, inclusive learning environments for students where they feel that sense of belonging. And I will tell you, over the last several months when I've gone out to sites and talked to teachers, and we talk about books and maybe why they are or not getting approved, this is probably the #1 topic that they bring up, that they want and need to diversify our book selection in order to really make students feel safe and get that sense of belonging in the classroom so that they can learn at high levels. And that, of course, leads into our windows and mirrors discussion, and really a philosophy that we want to provide students literature that allows them to really look at their own experiences, possibly analyze those in different ways, but also provide windows into other students' experiences to really expand their horizons so that when they go off into the real world, in their jobs and when they travel, they'll have a better understanding of really other people's experiences and be able to walk in their shoes at least a little bit. And then Dr. Malloy alluded to this today, and he actually said it last night at the Ed Fun Night of the Stars, that we have an absolutely amazing group of teachers. And in the several districts that I've been in, whether it's Michigan or Illinois or now in California, they are top notch, the absolute best educators that I have ever been associated with. And I really want to value their expertise, whether there are certificated staff members, our teacher librarians, certificated. They were trained in this. They were trained in the standards. They were trained to choose books in order to support students in learning at high levels. And I really want to recognize and value that expertise. And I do not want that to be lost in the conversation. So in terms of educational governance, again, that's kind of the larger umbrella under which I put these 5 topics. So we have content standards and curriculum frameworks, and I'm going to go into each of these in a bit more depth. We have instructional materials. So what are they? What do I mean by that? We, of course, have ed code or laws that are governing the operation of our educational institution of SRV. We have board policies and administrative regulations, and then we have currently used internal processes that mesh with those other policies and laws. So again, I'm kind of starting pretty broad here and going down, but I think it's important to kind of set the stage. So the state of California has adopted a set of standards. And so by law, it is incumbent upon us as educators to teach students those standards. There's not wiggle room there. That is the expectation. And so those are content standards. There's also curriculum frameworks, and those are a little bit different. And so those are created by the state, something called the Instructional Quality Commission, which is a branch of the State Board of Education. But those are more guidance documents. They explain how we should be teaching social studies, how we should be teaching ELA, how we should be teaching math. So for example, the new math framework, curriculum framework came out in the last year. So what we do as a system is we read through that and we value that. There's the state of California and educational researchers, educators put it together, but we can also kind of pick and choose based on our setting, based on our values, what from that framework we want to use and maybe what we don't want to use. So again, making that distinction between content standards and curriculum frameworks. Instructional materials, a very, very broad term. Okay, so that's basically anything a staff member could use as a learning resource. Okay, that supports students in acquiring the knowledge and skills, developing cognitive processes, such as the ones that we highlight in our learner profile, competencies like critical thinking, can be anything. They can be printed, they can be non-printed, textbooks, books, technology-based, anything. Okay. So it's a really broad overarching term. This slide is a bit more important because it really delves into, and I'm maybe oversimplifying it, but for this discussion, I feel like I really needed to make a distinction between board adopted instructional materials and non-board adopted instructional materials. Okay, so we have board adopted. The non-board adopted, we really refer to overall as supplementary resources. Okay, so board adopted instructional materials, of course, are selected and approved by the school board for use in the classrooms. And so for teachers, for the most part, use those to teach those standards that we have to teach by the state of California law. Now, that doesn't mean they have to use every page in the book. Again, we hired our teachers for their professional judgment. They have a set of standards. They have curriculum materials to support them in teaching those standards. And then they make their professional judgment in terms of what to use, how to use it, and potentially how to bring in supplementary resources. Now, it's a little bit different in ELA, of course, than it is in other subject areas. So for example, if you recall I think it was December, we adopted a middle school social studies tier 1 curriculum, National Geographic. So that's our tier 1. Every student in grades 6, 7, and 8, their core adopted curriculum is National Geographic. Okay. And again, the teachers use most of it to support the teaching of the standards. TWIG in elementary science, Eureka in elementary math. ELA is a little bit different, particularly in the secondary level, because we don't have a textbook to teach ELA. Although I think they did back in the day when I was in high school, but they don't anymore. We primarily use books and novels. And so it's interesting because those standards that I referred to earlier for ELA, they don't say that you have to teach To Kill a Mockingbird. They don't say that you have to teach a particular book or novel. Instead, they say you have to teach these particular standards, but the mechanism through which you do it, the vehicle, depends on you, your expertise. Who are the students sitting in front of you? And so that's where it gets a little bit different, but they're still board adopted ELA books, as we all know, that's why we're here. And those books are really for whole class use. And I will get into that more in a few slides. So then we move over to non-board adopted instructional materials, again, also known as supplementary resources. And you can really think of that as like anything else a staff member would bring in to support teaching of the standards. So it could be a video they saw on how to teach a component of the Civil War. It could be a poem on geometry that a math teacher brings in, right? Articles on current events, different online resources. Lexia, Dreambox, those are all supplementary resources. So for examples for ELA would be books and novels that they would use for a book club, for read aloud, independent choice reading, the books in the library. So you can kind of see that distinction there. Some other really important ed code considerations that you may hear, you probably already know about, or you hear about if you go out to schools, is the Fair Education Act. And you can see there that it was adopted in 2000, or passed, I should say, in 2011. And it requires that all California public schools provide fair, accurate, inclusive, and respectful representation of our diverse ethnic and cultural population. Now, the thing there is sometimes I do hear it misappropriated a bit, because primarily the FAIR Act is used in K-12 social studies curriculum. So the expectation there is that it is incumbent upon us as educators, this is the law, that we are representing the contributions in social studies, the contributions to our society of our LGBTQ+ community, of our African American community, of our transgender community, of our Hispanic Latinx community. That is incumbent upon us to do that. Primarily, we do think about it through the social studies lens. Then you have something, we've talked less about this, but it's called social content standards. And again, this is the state of California, and it is expectation that we have. And this applies a little bit more to our ELA conversation today. That again, it is incumbent upon us to portray accurately and equitably the cultural and racial diversity of American society, to demonstrate the contributions of minority groups, males and females, to the development of not only California, but the United States, to emphasize people in varied, positive, and contributing roles in order to influence students' school experiences constructively. This last one's my favorite. It cannot contain inappropriate references or brand logos. So I don't know how that one got fit in there, but it's somewhere I'm sure it made sense, but I think the first three bullets make a little more sense in the context of our conversation. So you can see that those are all things that I feel like we really need to take into consideration in this discussion today. There's also Assembly Bill 1078, and Governor Newsom just signed that in the fall of 2023, so less than a year ago. Prevents districts from banning books and censoring curriculum based on the material's depiction of inclusive and diverse perspective, and just kind of reaffirms that California supports accurate and inclusive education, and that both are essential to ensure the educational success of all of our students. So moving on from more state laws to specific policies and administrative regulations that govern what we do. So we have 6161.1, and that is the selection and evaluation of instructional materials in SRVUSD. Especially the BP here is pretty much what you would expect. So the board needs to adopt materials that are aligned to the standards. We know that. That's state law. Okay. The superintendent designee shall develop a review process for materials recommended to the board. We have that, and I feel very confident with that. The review process shall involve teachers in a substantial manner. Extremely proud of my curriculum and instruction team and how they've really listened to teacher and student voice, but particularly teacher voice when adopting these materials, and shall encourage the participation of parents, guardians, and community members. And then another component of 6161.1 that a little bit before my time used to be a component of this was that anytime you bought 11 or more books, you had to get them board approved. And I think the rationale there was if you're using 11 or more, then that means that it's impacting such a number of students that it needs to go to the board for approval. Well, I will tell you when they changed this, and I think it was right before my time, inadvertently, they left that off. So technically it is not in that policy. With that being said, I can assure everybody on this board that that is a process that we absolutely 100% still use. So anytime somebody wants to purchase 11 or more books, we take them to the board for approval. There is a process that Evan Miller's done a great job working with his team. They flag it. My assistant Gabby does a great job. She flags it. There's many mechanisms in place for us to do that. So I'm very proud of that. But at the same time, it was inadvertently left off of that policy. And I want to be clear with you on that. We also have AR 6161.1, which again, administrative regulation that just goes into a little bit more depth with regard to the board policy. And these are some of the things that we talked about earlier. We will not, in selecting and evaluating materials, we will not choose things that adversely reflect poorly on persons based on their race, ethnicity, gender, etc. We provide for a wide range of materials at all levels of difficulty, and that we include materials that stimulate discussion of contemporary issues that improve students' critical thinking skills. Okay. So in February of 2023, when this issue started to heat up, our fabulous teacher librarians, especially Allie Usene, came, and she and I gave a presentation that we used our board policies in our ARs, but this what we shared process went into a little bit more depth with regard to the process of choosing books. So what we said, for example, were they have to be consistent with the goals of the district, our strategic directions, relevant to today's world, something that kids are interested in, motivate students to examine their attitudes, to understand their rights, and that they had to be age appropriate. The age appropriate piece does become complicated, and that's probably also the biggest conversation I've had with teachers when I go out to sites, because they say, you know, how do we assess that? Because while it's really important, there are several different sites that at times assess it in several different ways. Back, I think back before I was at the district office, we agreed to use Common Sense Media. Common Sense Media does not have all of the resources. There's not one magic thing out there that has everything that we can look at to evaluate age appropriateness. So it does get a little bit gray and complicated there. Additional policy considerations, we have 6141, and that's curriculum development and evaluation. And again, I didn't go too much into that because it's essentially what you would expect, which is, you know, the district needs to adopt a research-based curriculum that is aligned with our vision. We also have BPAR 1312.2, and that is important because we have been using that over the last year and a half when it comes to parent complaints about either board adopted materials or supplementary materials. And essentially what that complaint process says is that the parent or caregiver, excuse me, will, if they have an issue, they will start with the principal and the teacher, and they will discuss that issue, that concern. They will sit down, they will try to come up with a remedy. If the parent or caregiver is not satisfied with that remedy, it goes to like kind of the next step. And the next step is the curriculum and instruction team. And we evaluate it based on the board policy and the process that I just went over. And we say, did we follow this process when we adopted this book or when someone chose to use this text or whatever it may be? If the answer is yes, we did, and I have to tell the parent that I don't agree with them, that we did follow the existing policies and practices and processes, then that's when it goes to the board. And that's what Dr. Malloy, of course, was talking about when he said that there's been, I think since I've been director for the last 5 years, one of those that came to the board a few months ago. So, and then we have, well, there's an existing CSBA policy, 6161.11, that focuses on supplementary resources, and that is currently not adopted. We have not adopted a supplementary resources policy in SRVUSD. And I did want to mention, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the upcoming guidance from CDE on this topic. Obviously, this is something that they've been hearing a lot about from districts across the state. So they are coming up with some upcoming guidance, but I don't know when that is. Supposed to be summer, but we'll see. All right. So that's the educational governance piece. Now I'm moving really into the last part of the presentation, where again, I'm really aiming to do some level setting in terms of the practices and the key terms that we use in our ELA classes. So again, maybe a minor oversimplification, but essentially we use books in these 5 ways in our ELA classes, whether it's K-5, 6, 8, 9, 12. We use full class or whole class novels where everybody's reading the same book, and I'll go over these. We use book clubs or literature lit circles. We use those terms synonymously. You'll hear book clubs from some schools, literature circles from other schools. It's the same thing. We have mentor texts and anchor texts. We also have read alouds, and then we have independent and choice reading. So this first slide is really, really important. So full class novel, what is it? Why would we use it? And how would we use it? So over the last, 10 or 15 years, best practice has really dictated that we don't tend to use full class novels very much. So when I went to high school, right, every novel was, we would all read this, then we would all read that. Not, not a lot of choice in our novels that we read. That is not best practice anymore. So the vast majority of our teachers might use a full class novel like once beginning of one semester and then another at the beginning of the second semester. Why did they do that? Well, it's important before I go to the why, that these would have to be texts on the approved list because they're 11 or more. Obviously, we don't have classes of 10 students, so they would have to be on the already approved list. Why would they use it? Often they look at like the most difficult or challenging standards and they say, we need to really dissect those standards as a class, and therefore we need to do it with a whole class novel. So we're reading the book, we're all going through it about the same time, getting to about the same place at the same time. It builds a sense of community and they can really teach those tougher standards that the kids really need to understand in order to go off and read their own books. Okay, so that's really, really important. Paced reading schedule, students are at the same place, allows time in class for everybody under the direction of the teacher to analyze the book, discuss the book. So that's whole class novels. Everything else I'm about to say is essentially supplementary, but there are some exceptions, right? Like the more we talk about this, the more complicated it gets, and I'll explain that in a second. But so book clubs or lit circles, students are typically put into small groups, 2 or more, and they're asked to read the same novel or book. Again, they've kind of had some level setting with that whole class novel. They've understood some of the key concepts. You're just starting out the school year oftentimes with those whole class novels. Oftentimes our teacher librarians support teachers with the curation of those books. The teacher might go to the teacher librarians. My kids are interested in this. I'm trying to do this. What are some books you think might be appropriate? And then those small groups of students read the book at the same time and at the same rate. And then they come to class prepared to have discussions in smaller groups about the book. Excuse me. And so a teacher may introduce an important theme or issue first through a full class read. Then the class participates in smaller communities about that same topic, about a different book, so they can really apply what they learned through that whole class novel. And so that's really, really important. Now, when I say it starts to get complicated, if I have 5 classes of English 9, and I want to do a lit club book and include book X, then I'm probably going to have 11 or more, and I am going to have to get those approved. And I know that some staff members do feel that that is a bit onerous. I wanted to put that out there and represent their thoughts. Okay, so then we move on to mentor texts and anchor texts, and some teachers use these terms interchangeably. And so what are they? They are a high quality text, but when we use the word text, it doesn't mean that it's like in written narrative form or a book, a passage from a book. It could be, but it could also be a poem, multimedia, image. It could be a picture book, an information article, etc. You read it aloud as a whole class. Why would you do that? Really, again, to teach a specific skill. So all students have a unified experience that they can apply that skill to. And students generally do not receive their own copy to take home. It's really something that the teacher brings in and usually they use in class. And again, these would be supplementary materials. I find a poem, I find a video, etc. We have read alouds. We don't do read alouds very often at the high school level. We of course do at the elementary and some at the middle school level. And really, why do we do that? To model fluent reading, to promote comprehension and discussion amongst our students, especially our younger students who are still learning how to read or really learning how to comprehend what they're reading. The teacher selects a text that is engaging and during the read aloud really models oral fluency, expression, pacing, all those things that we typically think about that happening in elementary school. And again, read alouds, typically you wouldn't buy 11 or more. The teacher's reading them aloud, so supplementary resource. Independent choice reading. So this can be free reading. So books from the library where students choose whatever they feel they're interested in. Could also be themed, like a teacher could give them a particular theme and then they find a book in the library to read based on that particular theme. And this is really, well, really most of this besides whole class novel, choice and voice of students, which we talk so much about in this district, really comes in pretty much every step of the way. Independent choice reading, booklet circles, maybe not whole class novels, but it does come in so many other ways in our ELA courses. So that is really the summary. And so I guess I will ask before any closing remarks, do you have any questions or clarifications that you would like to ask of us with regard to anything that we shared?
I have a question about the 11 or more.
Mhm.
And kind of, you'd mentioned that at some point in the past, there was just an oversight of it being taken off. I don't know, was that, I guess for Rachel, do you have any memory of that? Do we have any insight into how that happened? Was it just that it literally was oversight, or was it a conversation that the board had? I'm just curious about the history.
So that's a great question. We did a fair amount of research and went back to like the Kathy Moores and the Carol Laughlins and the, kind of the old guard. And I literally think it was done inadvertently. I cannot find a rationale for why it was taken out. Now, with that being said, I've had lots of conversations with staff about a rationale for why it's 11 or more. Because some do view that as arbitrary. So you can kind of see it both ways, but I cannot find any evidence that that was a concerted decision based on evidence or a strong rationale as to why we would do that.
And I think you described it so well in terms of how you framed how the book is used in a classroom when you're talking about voice and choice, because the place where it seems like it's relevant is when you don't have a choice because the whole class is reading this book for these reasons. And so 11 is kind of arbitrary for the example you gave, where a teacher is going to have several groups. So the 11 is becoming more like a accounting bookkeeping thing, which you actually talked about with the
Right.
flagging. And so maybe rather than a number, it's about the purpose and the intentionality of a whole class read and why we do it and what's framed around that in terms of criteria or whatever. And then everything else in the supplemental, because it's really important. I think that we're getting at why, right? If the idea is that kids being forced to read the book or whatever, then that's where we would need these protections as opposed to anything else where there are many options, as long as someone else wants to read the book with you, right?
So can I clarify that?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that it really would come down to the purpose, and that the 11 plus, I would imagine, was chose for like logistical clerical purposes at some time. Right. And that has actually worked. We have a great system for it, but really it should be the purpose. So if you're doing a whole class novel, those would have to be board approved. If you're using.
You're even that clear about it. These are approved whole class novels. And then you're being really clear about what the purpose is, and then it's not arbitrary and it's not getting in the way of if five
Yeah.
classes want to use the book at the same time.
Yeah, and it kind of that, there's that the idea of a textbook for many lay people, is a textbook where it's like a social studies textbook. It's not a novel. A social studies textbook, I'm going to take it home as a student and I'm going to study yes, the teacher will guide me, but I'm going to study those notes, right? Those bullet points
Mhm.
and digest it and understand it with the teacher's guidance, but oftentimes at home alone. Whereas, with a novel, sometimes it's oftentimes teacher led and, but yeah, I think kind of uncoupling that textbook from novel too.
And I really like the idea of how you framed the whole class novel and its purpose, because we often get into these binary things of good and bad, as opposed to there's a role and then there are other roles, because there is kind of a canon of what means to be an educated person, but then it doesn't need to be everything is like that. And I love how you tied it to the learner profile, and that then you can learn more about something, but doing it in an adaptable way that now relates to you. And just the whole thing sounds very coherent that way, but not taking away the role of some whole group direct instruction.
Yeah,
been waiting
no,
to
no, I want to piggyback on the conversation because I think it is good and I think it is arbitrary. In many ways, if there is now the nuance I would add is an assigned to group, like, hey, you're reading book A, you're reading book B, and now there's more copies, then it feels a little bit more curriculum. And that's where it's hard to create these arbitrary 11 or more books. I would also argue that if you buy one book and read it to 300 elementary students, what actually has a broader reach? That rule kind of becomes completely thrown out the window with the intention of that there. So there's, it's in, and that's why this conversation is difficult. It's like trying to navigate around like the simplest, the best. We don't want draconian policies. We also don't want to individually adjudicate every single thing that's coming here. That's not what we want to do. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the 11 plus, like, is there a need for it or not?
Can I just
Yeah.
ask a clarifying question? Sorry to interrupt, but currently are the all class books, are they not currently adopted by the board, approved by the board?
They are. To use an all-class novel, it does have to be adopted by the board.
Okay.
First read alouds were, which kind of gets at what Jesse was getting at about, the entire elementary school is going to hear this book, and therefore it's falling in the category of everyone's getting it.
And I think part of what your discussion needs to help us understand as the staff is, what role do you see yourself playing in this? For example, right now, you have a role to play for what we've just described. Secondly, through our process and policy, there is an expectation regarding what leaders will do when parents have questions or concerns. As I said at the beginning, that is a process that goes on every single week in our schools. And then thirdly, there's a process that makes its way all the way to you should there be a problem. That's what exists now. And the policy and process that's presently there provides you with obviously authority. It provides us with a responsibility, and it provides our staff with expectations with enough room for them to apply to the learner profile, apply to the standards and so forth. So part of what this discussion is as well is what role do you feel you should be playing in it? And then how does that align with good governance and with law? Because that's where I think this discussion, if I'm going to put candor right on the table across this country, gets really challenging.
Yeah. And actually to that point, sorry, Shelley.
Go ahead. No, go.
I wanted to ask Namita a question too, maybe as for setting like a legality baseline for us as a board. Can you go more into AB 1078? I think Fair Act was pretty clear, but then also there's been some judgments on this. Fletcher versus McCarthy seems to talk to this. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
So, I'm going to talk like big picture in terms of how it should work within the framework of the law and the cases and the statutes. So the idea is, yes, it's the State Board of Education that comes up with the standards, and then there at every level, the statute intends that parents, community members, teachers, school boards all sort of work together. And so once you have the curriculum and you're selecting the textbook adoption process, it comes to the board. But many boards actually wait for a couple of board meetings so that they allow parent groups to weigh in on the curriculum that is being adopted. And that becomes really important because every community is different. There might be some more interest in, I'm just making this up, Filipino history versus say, history of Arab Americans, based upon the community. And so allowing parents an opportunity to weigh in at that time, parents and community, becomes really important. The board then adopts. but there's one more step in there, which is where the teacher voice, the statute also says that there is a curriculum adoption committee where we sit down, the district sits down with a group of educators who are appointed by the union, who are subject matter experts, who actually look and see whether or not this, from a art of delivering instruction perspective, is going to meet and achieve the standards. And so once that is ratified, then it comes back to the board for actual approval. And, parent voice is really important. I mean, I think bottom line for us is not just the curriculum adoption, it's also around how do you get parents involved in what the students are learning or what they're reading. I mean, that's where the real issue is. And so parents have a voice up there in terms of when the curriculum is adopted, big picture. I think many districts have a supplementary materials policy. And if you look at supplementary materials policy for most districts, they leave it. So there are two components to it. There is the supplementary materials where teachers, based upon their academic judgment, based upon their professional expertise, choose supplementary materials to bolster the learning that's happening in the class. And it may be, you're talking about the space shuttle, and you talk about Sally Ride, and there might be a book about Sally Ride, and you share that. It's not part of the material, but it is part of the supplementary material. Again, that generally 9 times out of 10 is not problematic. It's the ELA courses where you get up in the high school years, where you're reading materials, where there might be some controversial subject. So when you get to that place, what the education code and the statutes envision, and much of the CSBA model policy that exists across many districts, not all districts have a supplemental material adoption policy, but when districts do, they provide a lot of leeway to the teacher. It is left up to the educational prerogative of the educator. There is more specific language if you're going to use videos, and if you're going to use clips of movies that may not be age appropriate, that are more, the based upon the rating scale, G or NC-17. There's a lot more process-driven language in the supplementary material adoption policy there. But in terms of reading, ELA, that kind of discretion is left up to the teacher. Now, the way I read your policy, you do not have a supplemental adoption materials policy. So anything that is being adopted by the district is being held to a higher standard because the district is putting a vote on it. You are actually officially adopting it as a text one, what do you call it, level 1 text adoption. But I think it's the one-offs where you are in that situation in the classroom where you may have a complaint from a parent and not necessarily a student that gets to be problematic. And so there are districts that do various things. There are districts that actually send out a list of potential additional readings that may happen if parents have a problem. They can let the teachers know. There is also many districts have like a digital sign-in process where there is, maybe a link, a hyperlink, or a QR code where parents can see. And then there are teachers who actually will let you know a week before a particular book may be assigned to a small group of kids that they're going to be reading that. So there are different ways to address the issue. I think there is the fundamental level of belief in the expertise of the educators, and then that has to be adopted with notification, like parent notification. And I think it becomes difficult. If you're reading one book to a school of 300 kids, if it's a controversial subject, you have a controversial subject policy. If it's a controversial subject, we apply that policy. Give the parent the right to opt out because it's a controversial subject. But I think and you're not the only district where there is a lot of push and pull is where the student is reading the book and the parent comes into it late, and they are objecting to the fact that the students are reading the book because they believe that their student is not mature enough for the content. And I understand that. So I think that is the big picture, but the board has the right to adopt the curriculum. all textbooks have to be adopted by the board, always available to the parents and community for a preview. And I would say best practice, give 2 public meetings, 2 months, let people actually look at what you're proposing and adopting, and then they come to the board meeting and voice their concerns at that point.
And Debbie, we're currently doing 1 to 1.5 based on when the next board meeting is. Is that typically how we do it for adoption?
You're exactly right. So typically what we do, whether it's a curriculum adoption like I brought recently or a book, we take it 1 meeting for preview. And then the next one is for adoption. The books are always available in my office out for display. Anybody can come at any time. I've had very few people come, but I've had 1 or 2 say, it's not convenient. Can you meet me at, 6 at night? And, we make that happen one way or another, right? Because we know our working hours are not convenient for everybody. But it's actually been advantageous having about 1 board meeting a month because it does give parents and caregivers more time to come in if they wanted to. It's to be 2 weeks, right? Exactly.
And I can add that if the board wanted to extend the time, then because we are planning not to do it every meeting, that's something that could be built in. And the only other thing I think is important to put on the table that I would be remiss if I didn't mention it is the reason why I think it's important for us as a staff working with your direction to understand kind of what the parameters are of your expectations, understanding parents' voice and our educators' professionalism is that we're talking about a paradigm that the world of technology, digital resources, and artificial intelligence is actually almost contradicting this. I just need to put that on the table because we've been trying to lean into the forward thinking approach. If we're not teaching responsible use, if we're not working with our parents to help us with that, if we're not partnering with our educators to keep understanding, we're actually having a discussion around an approval paradigm, which is absolutely legal, valid, and necessary in a context that's galloping that much further away from us, where there are no approvals. And then frankly, no matter what, you all know what our kids can do. They get around walls, they get around everything. And that's why you've raised in this body that we've got to do more work. And we're actually looking into that on how do we partner with parents to educate our kids to be healthy in the digital space, something we haven't done. And I'm only offering that because we have that conversation a lot. And we're having this important conversation as well. And I'm just putting them out there like this because they don't live together that easily. They're 2 different paradigms that require different strategies. And I sometimes wonder when we are so deeply in one paradigm, what are our kids saying when they are living most completely in the other one?
Can I ask a question about the review process
Mhm.
that you and who is on the committee that actually reviews the books? Because I'm looking at our board policy and it says, in addition, the instructional materials review committee may include administrators, other staff who have subject matter expertise, and students as appropriate. And above that, it says participation of parents, guardians, and community members.
So it depends on, so I would like to separate like a curriculum adoption, like I brought forward. I'll use middle school social studies, Nat Geo, where we typically, actually that one was a 1.5 years, but we typically for something like that have a process that lasts for about a year. And we inform parents that their children will be using alternative curriculum materials. Teachers use those materials or a subset. We gather data each month on those, right? Because that's like a 10-year, 15-year, multi-million-dollar commitment, right? And then we eventually make a decision. Typically, the group is made up of mainly teachers, some administrators, and is usually led by somebody on my team, like a coordinator or a director. So that's kind of the traditional curriculum materials that we think about. In terms of books, the way it works is there will be a subset of teachers, typically at a particular site, although it could run across sites, that And lately, it's really been an effort to diversify the windows and mirrors idea, right? We really need to provide our students with different books so that they're more engaged in class. They read those books, and as a department, they agree that that's something that they want to move forward. Then the administrators at that site sign off on those books, and then that paperwork comes to me. And I ensure that that process that we shared in February of 2023 was followed in terms of linked to our strategic directions, age appropriate, and then that's when I bring them to you. And then the parent involvement piece is really primarily during the preview, where they will have an opportunity to come and read the book and provide feedback.
So we don't have any participation in that part of it from parents or students or any other stakeholders.
In a formalized way, no.
If I may just add one more thing, in your current board policy, and I'm specifically talking about 6141, it states, the superintendent or designee shall establish a process for curriculum development, selection, and or adaptation, which utilizes the professional expertise of teachers, principals, business, district administrators. And it goes on to say the process may also provide opportunities for input from students, parents, guardians, representative of local businesses, post-secondary institutions, and other community members, which is going to become more and more robust given that you are going to be looking at AI and all of that stuff. So you already have places, if you feel that a particular voice is not being heard, that we can use the current process that exists to bolster their presence on the development of the committee.
And just to pick up on that, because certainly at cabinet, we've discussed that phrase often. And I'll just put it out there. The reason why we haven't invited partners to a formal committee versus thinking about how we can enhance input is because then we got into the discussion, which we have had with some of our steering committees. Who gets on and how do they get on? And when there's a perception that only certain people are getting on, et cetera, we actually went around and didn't know how to bring to you a strategy. So we simply went with the staff committee with your oversight with opportunities for input. So I want to put that out there candidly, that was a deep discussion, but we haven't brought to you any other formalizing of that because we actually struggled to figure out how to operationalize it in a way that would help bring our community forward as opposed to exacerbating some of the challenges that we've experienced. So I want you to know that so that you can think about that in your discussions as well.
And I will just add that you're not the only district that grapples with that. I mean, this is a common issue everywhere. And so maybe instead of many districts, what they do is instead of utilizing a formal parent body to actually be part of the curriculum committee, they are like a subcommittee that does a little bit of work on the front end and on the back end, but really it's the curriculum committee from the district personnel that really drives the process, but there is input, more formal parents and community input in a different fashion.
In the process, how it is, I'm assuming it is, but how is the fact that these books are taught to the students? It's professional discussion that's led by or discussion that's led by a professional teacher or a teacher librarian versus just a book in a silo that I'm going to read and I might have my own, opinions and adverse reactions to, but I'm unable to necessarily have that conversation and with a person who knows how to guide me through those sometimes difficult topics. Is when you're making decisions about a book being approved, is there a conversation about how those discussions will be led or what's required in those discussions in order to make sure that that those students are supported around a book that might have some difficult topics?
That's a great question. Yeah. So I know you all are out and about so much. And if you talk to English teachers about this, there's so much thought that is put into the books that they choose. And there's a rationale, there's a reason. They change it up because the students in front of them might look different that year or have different interests that year. They read the books thoroughly and think about how different kinds of students may react to that. I mean, our students, our teachers know their students and they know they're such professionals. They know how to teach their content areas. So it's not, I'm going to pick up this book and see how people like it. There's a lot more thought and decision that goes into it that is sometimes, I think, portrayed.
And then what is the process of a staff member, you know, seeing their class, deciding that they need to add some of the supplemental material, you know, whether it's a lit circle or whatever, and then submitting that for approval? So I'm a little confused too about the supplemental versus, but it sounds like right now, those lit circle books that are, if you're an English teacher and you have 5 sections and you choose, you know, 10 books for your lit circles, but maybe 3 of those, and those lit circles are 5 students each, maybe 3 of those sections choose 1 book. That's 15 books. So that means that you have to have approval, right? So that's
Correct.
part of that grayness that we kind of talked about a little bit before. But so if it's a book that does require approval, what does that staff member have to, what do they do to set up the proposal for the proposal in order to get that so that it potentially could be approved? Do they have to provide survey of the book? Do they, what?
They do. And so they meet as a team and then they have to fill out like fairly extensive paperwork where they talk about the objectives, like why they want to teach that book. They have to talk about any scenes that may be triggering, you know, if there's something in there that students may be disturbed by. They have to talk about who else, either within their site or across sites that they've spoken with, who are also maybe in support of this book. And then again, they have to get signed off by their administration and they have to do all that legwork before they send it to me. But yes, there's like several different questions they have to, like, what are your objectives? Why do you want to use this book? What's the purpose of this book? Are there things in this book that could be sensitive to students? And they definitely have to think through that and they do not take that lightly.
And then how long does this process take? So I asked that because I think about, you know, I have a different cohort for each year of students, and the world is changing fast. And you know, there's lots of, this process needs to have some nimbleness to it in order to really meet the student where they are in that moment in that class. And if it takes, you know, a few months for a staff member, as it should, to really get to know and see the needs of the students and that kind of thing, and then go through this process, and then it's another 6 months. Now we're at April, May. Are we really meeting the student where they are? So I'm just, I know I kind of went on a rant, but I'm curious about the time frame of how flexible this is.
So honestly, we used to be able to turn it over very quickly. And so someone would put something in and probably about a month later, especially when our board meetings were more close together, they would get it approved and they have to put in their paperwork. So it would take maybe 6 weeks and they could get the book. But over the last year, with a lot more discussions on books, the process has been slowed down a little bit. And so what we're hoping to do in the future, you know, after this and potentially after May 14th, is provide teachers with much clearer communication and a really explicit timeline of when they need to send us the books by, when they're going, and then when they get approved, and then when you can purchase them, and then when you will receive them after that purchase. And that's something that is really a high priority of mine personally. But it will obviously depend on some of these conversations that we have. We did talk, of course, about going to book approvals 2 times a year. And so in the spring, if you wanted to get, you do have to do some type of planning, right? So in the spring, you'd have to put in books to be purchased for the fall, and then later in the fall for second semester. But I am really proud of that. There's still some flexibility there in terms of some districts don't do it that way. Teachers can't buy books all the time. You know, there's actually a lot more limits on that. And so I've actually been pretty proud of our process and the flexibility that we've given teachers in terms of them looking at the kids in front of them and wanting to change course in terms of the books that they choose.
Well, it sounds like there is a lot of planning actually happening, especially with, because we don't have a policy on supplementary.
Mhm.
Right, but-
True.
But because of the number of books or whatever, material that needs to go through like the, even though it's not the curriculum, right, the full book use, but because of the lit circles and all that, I mean, teacher has to really planned out even for the supplementary
Yeah.
materials and then go through the whole thing.
Well, I think for some supplementary resources, like Laura was saying, if you're at a school, if I'm at a school and I have 3 different preps, if I have English 9, 10, and 11, and I'm doing different lit circles and kids have different interests, I might not have to get those books approved because it's not the 11 plus. But if I am, have all English 9, then I almost am certainly going to have to get those lit book circles approved because I will have more groups wanting to read those books. It will cross that 11 plus threshold, and then they will have to get them adopted. And then that, of course, does slow down the process a bit. That makes sense. Does that answer your question?
I'm just curious about the feedback that you got from teachers around the twice a year adoption.
Well, I think that
Because we did get one public comment from somebody saying, I really don't like this. This gets in the way.
oh, really? Okay, that's interesting.
Well, I've heard other comments like that.
No,
in
I'm
other
just thinking of the 3
municipalities.
that came in related to this meeting. One
Yeah.
of them definitely honed in on that.
Yeah, that's
problematic.
interesting because when I go out, I don't necessarily hear that. I think what the 2 times a year would really allow us to do would be behind the scenes to have a smaller committee made up mostly of teachers that would get together and read the books. And we would also love to provide you as board members more information about the books before it's been pretty sparse. Right. And that's been our culture here. And I want to be able to provide you a synopsis, links to the resources that we use to assess the age appropriateness, a rationale from the teachers, for example, for why they chose this book and how they're going to use it. And if we're going to do that, it would almost have to be 2 times a year because I can't do that every month.
And I just wanted to add that I think it's a balance. We have heard from some of our staff who want to just be able to do it whenever. And I totally get why that would be valuable. But I also have heard from you what you're asking for so that you can do your due diligence. And I just want to reiterate, that's why it needs a little bit more structure than maybe it did in the past when I arrived 4 years ago, it usually was on a consent agenda. It usually wasn't talked about, and it was usually done, and I'm not suggesting this is right or wrong, quickly. Now, we just need to be open to the fact that there is a process that the teachers and staff members engage in. There's a process that the district team engages in. You want to do your due diligence in light of some public interest around this, and it usually then involves discussion at a board meeting. So for that reason alone, the world has shifted a bit.
Mhm.
And for that reason also, I think we need to adjust. So the reason why we proposed, doing it a few times a year is so that we can strengthen a process, not try to limit our staff, but also to balance the workload that is surrounding this as well.
Yeah. And I like how you explain that, Debbie, with kind of the robustness of the presentation of the board, because that's sometimes difficult when you're looking through and you're like, I've got a sentence on this book, a sentence on this book, and there might be a few books or there might be a lot, and you're kind of trying to dig through them. And I think also sometimes too, if you do find, okay, there's maybe some concerning material or material that some might feel is concerning in a certain book, having the understanding from the educator of, I understand it's eyes wide open on this. Here's why. Like, it would be an easier place as a board member to start from there. And I think Rachel, you even brought that up in one of, like, it would be great for us to get a Common Sense Media or American Library Association synopsis of the book as we're reviewing it. So even though I do see, I mean, Dr. Malloy brings up a great point on maybe this wasn't what was needed 10 years ago and hopefully not needed 10 years from now, but this is the time and place maybe where we have to change a little bit.
John, you asked a little earlier, like really kind of like, what is the board's role, right? And when we're given, 10 books to approve in one meeting, we really can't read them all. So I don't ever like when we are just a rubber stamp, but I think our role is that we make it a public process, right? Even though we might not get to read them all, it's, hey, community, this is being looked at. You can check these books out if you want. It's the transparency of the public process.
I just want to add, what you said is spot on, but I think very often, especially for higher grade English, there is also the mechanics of how a book is written, the grammar, the structure, things like soliloquy and all of that. That sometimes gets overshadowed because we are training our students to be really good writers as well. So you may have a book with a spicy topic, but at the end of the day, the teacher may be using it for a purpose to really help the students be better writers or to examine what a dream analysis is. I mean, I'm just making the example.
And that's where I think in defending stuff, it would really help, like, what is the educational value?
And
It's not, and maybe the spiciness is just to get the kids interested, but the educational value is not that.
exactly. So I'm just, so while you can get the printout from Common Sense Media or American Library Association, there is the actual value of the writing that only an educator can really attest to that would need to be addressed.
I really appreciate you
Yes,
bringing
yeah.
up that point in that level of detail. I had a different angle, so Debbie, if you have.
Well, I just
something
want
you
to add
follow
on
up.
to that because I agree. It's such a good point, and I've talked to so many teachers, some of which are in the audience, about, you're making it really challenging when we have like a junior or especially senior level class, AP class. It's supposed to be a college class, but you're limiting me because we can't do books of that age, right? So I wonder if we have some of those more adult books, but we talked about the educational value, who the audience was, why it's beneficial for these high level students to be engaging in these books. Then it might make a lot more sense
you're
to
like
you and to
confronting
the
that, right?
community. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And something I wondered about at the high school level, because I mean, I think most of us are pretty familiar with the book bins in elementary, and every classroom has a classroom library. But are these books part of the secondary teacher's classroom library? Or are they part of the textbook room? Are they live in the library? Is there a mixture? Because I think probably ultimately a big piece of this is, what is public money being spent on? And therefore, what kind of oversight comes involved with it?
Oh, there's a
And
term.
how
yeah.
far does this money stretch, especially given our current forecast on curriculum?
Well, there needs to be a discussion about, if you choose to put a book forward, you need to commit to using the book for X number of years, unless there's a really good reason not to. And so that's one thing. Although there is very good oversight, especially at the high school level, because we have textbook clerks. So either our ELA departments have a room, everything's barcoded, they check kids out, the books out, they make sure to get them back at the end of the year, end of the semester, whatever it may be. If they don't, there's very good processes at our high schools on how we organize that. So I feel good about that.
But your
that
point
answer
is
your-
that when they're choosing a book at this level, going through this rigorous process for getting it approved, they're intending to use it for a while.
Yes, but I would like to put more stop gaps to ensure that that's the case, especially in our, economic situation, stewardship of resources. Yeah. So I feel like if we go back, based on discussions we might have over the next few weeks, changing up the paperwork a little bit and getting people to agree to use a book for a certain amount of time is very important. Most do, you're right, but
Because when a book is adopted by the board, not only one class, one teacher uses, right?
you're exactly right, Susan. Yeah. Trustee Ordway, yes.
One question too, because it seems like we have supplemental materials that are board approved. And we have. So when we get a packet, like, gosh, I feel like just within the last several months, it would say, here's a novel.
Mhm.
It's supplementary educational curriculum. Is that different than supplemental the way we're discussing it?
It ideally should not say supplemental. Like if you're getting a book, then that is not supplemental. That is something that we have to buy 11 or more copies of.
Okay.
And I can go back and examine that paperwork if we're writing it incorrectly. Because really what this process has allowed us to do over the next few months is really kind of tighten up the words we use
Yeah.
and how we're approaching things. And so I can go back and check on that.
Yeah, because I think a few of them have been described to me as, well, it's not our, it's not CKLA. It's not part of our core curriculum, but it's supporting that. But we also want to board approved because it's going to be a kind of mandatory all class read aloud, and it was described as supplemental. So that's why I was getting a little confused. So for
I
the sake
hear
of
ya.
our discussion here and kind of moving forward, are we defining supplemental as these are not things that are coming before the board?
Well, I think this is where we're getting to
Yeah.
this differentiation in the policy, but maybe we need to be looking at one of the things that it describes it is how is this book being used? Is it a whole class read or is it a book club lit circle read?
I agree with you. And so just what I'm thinking about during this conversation, if you are reading it if an entire class is reading it, or if you're in third grade and reading it to an entire class, then that needs to come before the Board of Education and needs to be approved. If you are using it as a lit circle for a smaller number of students, if you are using it as independent choice reading for a small number of students, that is supplementary and that would not come before the Board of Education.
So one question on this, thinking of whoever is on the board and in these seats 10 years from now, is that actually described in our policy where if we all vanished one day and somebody showed up to run our school district, is that clear in our policy?
It is not
Okay.
currently.
Because we don't have a policy.
Yeah, and I think
Well, yeah,
because we don't have the supplemental,
yeah.
currently don't have the supplemental policy, it would be having in a regular meeting, taking action, working through the idea of uncoupling, I guess, essentially the two so that it's two separate policies. I mean,
But one thing I want to bring up that I don't want us to inadvertently do here is that read aloud is a really powerful way for a teacher to deal with something that's happening in the classroom. Some conflict, some whatever, and he or she may go to the library or go to their own personal library and choose a book. We're going to read Chrysanthemum because we're going to deal with kids teasing each other about names or whatever it is. That book shouldn't have to be approved.
Yeah.
With a 6-month lead time, the teacher needs to be able to deal with it in the moment. So I think on the read aloud, I think we do want to be careful.
But I wonder, I agree, and we've had these conversations, like something happens in the classroom, there's this great learning opportunity. I don't want to say in 6 months, I'll get this, bring this book back to address this. So I'm wondering if, in some ways that could be seen as supplementary. And maybe in one of those other categories, like a mentor text, I don't know. I don't know exactly what, but maybe, mentor text or anchor text that wouldn't have to, the whole book could be read for a very specific purpose. But it would not necessarily have to be approved.
But I do think in the very thoughtful way that the very large read aloud purchases were made, with a really deliberate focus on windows and mirrors and bringing in this group and that group and all that. Having those go through the process is important because it wouldn't really be right for our teaching staff, and no offense to the diversity of our teaching staff, but if we're now picking a book that's going to highlight Indian American culture or, any of the groups that we might be highlighting, I think maybe some of those groups that we're trying to include might want a little bit of say is that the right one to include, right? And especially when we're being really deliberate about being inclusive, because I know at least years ago when I was on the board, there were members of our Indian American community coming to us saying, I don't like how my culture is represented in our sixth grade text. And we need to lean into that memory of that they should get some say about, does this book represent my culture?
Yeah, it's like the point that was brought up in one of our past board meetings too, of like, Jewish history shouldn't always be Holocaust, right? It's like in listening to culture's feedback on like, yeah, it seems like we're talked about and it's always the Holocaust, and that's not necessarily a positive thing for us. So yeah, no, I think and I really agree with you, Rachel. And like, there's got to be a parsing out of some of this, of like, how do you allow that teacher autonomy and using their educational expertise and experience? And when I was going through and preparing for this, one thing I did is I researched a bunch of other school districts in California and said, what are their policies, right? And there's a lot of AB 6161.11s out there. So I did a perusal on quite a few of them, a few dozen. And some of them are the very templated CSBA, and it kind of includes some very broad topics. Others, you can tell either they came up across something or they had something, and so they get a little bit more into it. And I really like some of them because you can provide teacher autonomy with like, all right, not everything has to go through the approval process now, but here's some guardrails to keep you safe, to keep you out of conversations, to keep our parents notified, and to give student choice and voice. Even someone like visual media, hey, you can always use a G-rated film in any and all rights as long as you're not breaking copyright or infringing on laws and things like that. It really parses it out in a healthy way.
I would suggest that there are two districts that have polarly different policies on supplemental materials. I would look at Santa Barbara, which is a more CSBA policy, and then you have Chino Hills, which has a parental notification component. Two different places, but it speaks very loudly to teacher expertise, certificated employee discretion, but you don't want such a policy that's going to clog the wheel. So the point that you are making where you want to pick up a book and read about a particular astronaut in that real time, that should be able to happen right away, even though you may be reading about Sally Ride to the entire third grade classroom, right? But those are the two models that if you are considering adopting a supplemental policy down the road, that we could look at, because they are different, and figure out how do we make which one fits best with our community, with our model, with our teachers.
Yeah, and I saw a few too where it's like, hey, here's a pretty like wide road that you can walk down, and here's a couple little catchphrases. If it includes this, here's like a secondary action that has to take place. And those were kind of ranging from you got to go to the principal and get approval. There's even, I think, something to be said for, hey, I want to show a clip from a film. The clip's not R-rated, the film is, but it was going to add to our discussion this way. And even some of them detailed, all you have to do is 5 days prior notice to parents with an opt-in or opt-out, and also have approval from the principal. I was like, that's super clear. You got a lot of leeway as a teacher, but you also have these like safety guardrails where, and I have had experiences just even this year with there was a big group of parents, and I'm gonna try to be really generic in how I say this, and I think Dr. Malloy will appreciate that considering what I walked into in one of the other meetings. So where a clip was played around a historical event, it was from a major TV publication, but there was some suggestive acts that were taking place because they were talking about Genghis Khan and all the things Genghis Khan did. And a lot of students reacted to that. And there was then a lot of parents notified. Now, if we had a supplemental policy, that teacher would have said, oh, well, then I'm going to follow through on this policy. And then there's no like outrage or outpouring of, hey, why did this happen? So in a way, I actually look at it as that teacher of going, hey, how do we provide some safety guardrails for them so that if we've followed all these steps where only when it concerns something that's really objectionable, that might be kind of going off into the weeds on, but also that students whose parents have no problem with that can still use that visual media. I don't know.
So just a time check. We know that we have at least 12 cards. So that would be considerable time. I'm not asking you to stop your conversation. You may need to decide how long this workshop is going to go. And I'm not sure how you want to do that, but Cindy kept texting me and I wasn't paying attention that we're getting to that point.
Our phones are all silenced.
Do we want to take some time to do public comment and then we can have some further discussion after that? Or is there any points or questions? Okay. Right. So I'm going to give a last call for public comment. So it looks like Bob has one. Okay, and then so that's the last call for public comment. So we'll start with I need my reading glasses. Emily Dolim. I'm sorry. Oh, you're not ready? No, that's fine. I can. Oh, okay. Well,
Go later.
sorry. After Emily will be Carrie Leadingham.
Hi, my name's Emily Dolm and I'm an English teacher at Monte Vista High School. It's my 12th year at Monte Vista and it's the process. Thank you for having me. I wanted to say that the process for the last 12 years at Monte Vista has been going really well. I've had no complaints at any time and I'm not familiar with my colleagues running into any trouble either. So I realize that it's a different climate that we're in now, but I just wanted to say that the system and the freedom that we have has really been working really well for the most part. And I'm really sorry that you're getting a different impression of how the system has been experienced. And I guess 2 points that I wanted to make was I would love to see the supplementary system stay broad so that we can be really responsive to what's going on in the world at the time. And then also to student choice. I was thinking back to, I guess it was a couple years ago, because now that's the student I'm thinking of specifically in college. But with my AP Lang students, I have a memoir book club unit, and I give them a lot of choice as to which memoirs they'd like to study with their book club. And one of my students, of Zaid Fatah, who you might remember, he actually was like, what if we read this one? And he brought in his own idea about what he wanted to do. And it wouldn't have occurred to me on my own. And so because of the policy being really receptive to that, it allowed me to be flexible and the students got to read it. And it was wonderful that they got to do what they wanted in class while I was still able to work on the skills I really wanted them to develop. And then the other thing I just wanted to note that's been a concern is the age level appropriateness. While I think it's well intended, I think it can be really limiting, especially at the secondary level, because we're really looking for sophisticated books that are worthy of discussion for an extended time, especially if you're doing a class novel. And the young adult literature, while sometimes it's high interest, there might not be enough to sustain that level of interested and depth of discussion that you would need to really read a novel in the 6 weeks or so that you might take. And we need adult books to get our students ready to be prepared for the rigorous coursework that they're going to be experiencing in college and beyond. And I would just emphasize that the books that we have in the canon of the past, those were not YA either. They were adult books. So it's not anything new that we're requesting in that sense. We have mature books in the canon that are in our book rooms from the old days that we all read in high school. And now we want the mature books that are more reflective of a more diverse student body so that their voices are heard too. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Next up is Carrie Leadingham, and then after her is Carrie Knapp.
Hi, Carrie Leadingham, a longtime English teacher at Monte Vista High School, liaison for the past couple of years, worked with Debbie on what she was presenting tonight. I'm just going to echo all the great things Emily said. in terms of supplementary material, it makes me nervous to hear about a policy about supplemental material, but I was heartened to hear Mr. Van Z's, explanation of like why a supplemental policy might be necessary. For me, supplemental materials are have to be dynamic, they have to be timely. So, for example, when I was in pandemic school and January 6th happened, I mean, I was going to come in as an English teacher the next day, and we were going to like read some speeches that came from the floor of the House that happened just like less than 24 hours ago. So anything that would kind of limit that kind of dynamism when it comes to education and having currency would make me sad and nervous. And then I think about I like that you're taking a look at the 11 book, I don't know, the 11 book policy or not policy. I think also that book clubs and lit circle books are another way to keep things dynamic and current without having to spend a lot of money investing in big class sets, hundreds of books. So I like that you are kind of wanting to examine that. I'm wondering if we could come up with a designation on the barcode of the book that says board approved, and then a teacher would know, oh, I can use this as a full class novel. Or if we have 50 copies of this book in the book room, even though we have 50 copies, it's designated as a supplemental only and not a board approved book. So anyway, that's it.
Thank you, Carrie. Next up is Carrie Knapp. After Carrie is Lynn DeSix. Oh, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And Debbie, thank you. One thing I want to add real fast before I talk about what I'm really going to talk about is I just want to remind everybody that age appropriateness is not just a number. It is also a maturity level. And that's what a teacher needs to be able to address as well. But I want to talk about stewardship of resources. 20 years in this district, 100 years in the Valley with my whole family. We know this community well. We've been a part of it for a long, long time. We've always been interested in being responsible here in this area with our money and with our resources. 11 is an arbitrary number and one that means nothing. And so we do need to take a time to figure out how to not limit kids, right? For example, at Doherty Valley High School I just looked it up, on our Lit Circle master list, we have 253 titles available, the vast majority of which are not district approved. If we need to start approving these because we have more than 10 copies, y'all are gonna have a long night. And this has always been in response to student voice, student choice, by name, by need, all the different phrases that have come and gone over the decades since we've been here. These are in response to that. Some of it's been donors choose, some of it's been PTSA, some of it's been site fund, some of it's been textbook fund. The money comes from everywhere. There is not a longitudinal history other than those of us that have been here, right, around stewardship of our textbook resources. We've made strides in improving it, but there's more that we could do there. There's confusion with teachers around the process, when to do it, how to do it. What is this? I just got a teacher emailing me from another school today with confusion. Whatever we decide needs to be clear, and communicated. I want to encourage you guys to see this, and I think you do, as an opportunity to modernize and update our policies. Supplemental policies make me very nervous, but if we can do it together and be transparent and make teachers feel safe in this policy, that would be great. And lastly, same thing with textbook. We used to have a textbook adoption schedule. We had a calendar. I don't know what happened to it. I know that we have US history books where the last president featured is George W. Bush. We have teachers teaching with textbooks that they learned from in high school. We have AP books, which College Board requires that they are less than 10 years old, and we're totally out of compliance. And every time we ask, it's kind of a wall. So I would love to see us also kind of loop this in together as we have this opportunity. So thank you for today. Thank you, everything, Debbie, and here if you need me.
Thank you, Carrie. Next up is yes, Lynn. Yes, thank you. And after Lynn is Sandra Dadera. Sorry. I should put my glasses on before I read. You can, yeah.
I'm a parent who's not knowledgeable in the ways of this. I'm a parent, I'm just going to go ahead and read this, I'm sorry, of a student who spent her K through 12 years in the SRVUSD. I'd like to state how much I fully support the knowledge, experience, and judgment of the ELA teachers and librarians in our school. Thank you for providing fair, rich learning opportunities for our students. When I think about my child and her reading journey here, I think about the command halt and catch fire, because in a lot of ways that was her experience here. We chose to give her 2 first grades. She was struggling a little bit the first time. Second time, so she needed to halt. She needed to get a little extra time. But once she did, once reading really clicked for her, she caught fire. She developed a voracious appetite for reading that continues to this day. I don't think she would have developed her love of reading without the kinds of choice that we have in the books and literature. She's told me at the time that if she had to read another Magic Treehouse school book, she would have just stopped reading. It's a little dramatic, but she might have, because she was also hard-headed. Because she was older than many of her classmates, she started older and then did the second first grade. I can't see any way she would have found a book that drew her in the way these did. If we were trying to keep it just at a specific grade level. In 4th grade, she was reading books at 7th grade. So when I say caught fire, she caught fire. And I am grateful that she had access to all of those. If we fast forward a few years, she graduated magna cum laude with a degree in English. She continues to devour books. She writes fan fiction with a respectable following. She has begun a novella and is pursuing her master's on the road to a possible teaching credential. And for those, all of that tells me that the kind of breadth and depth and knowledge that you bring really makes a difference. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next up is Sandra Arcadera. And then, yes, sorry. And then after her is Julie Garaham.
Hi, I'm Sandra Arechidera, and I am the teacher librarian at Pine Valley Middle School. And am here just to speak about one thing that came up, and that was the idea of bringing forward 2 times a year approval in spring and in fall. A concern that we have about that is the inability to have fluidity of change. So if in spring, teachers are bringing forward for the fall, they have no opportunity to get to know their students that will be coming in. They're making those assumptions based on the students they have at the end of the year in spring for fall. And a concern of that I've spoken with a number of teachers and told them that I would come forward with their voice is that they make changes as they get to know their students. For instance, we have students in the 7th grade that have a high interest in dystopic novels and have decided to do a book club books because they're so interested in these changing times and how they see themselves in these vast changes that happen in dystopic novels. Having this ability to make this change, they're able to examine this with their students. They wouldn't be able to do that if they were forced, if they had to bring forward in just 2 times a year. So I am honestly bringing forward their voice, and I had said that I would come for them. The idea of fluidity of change has been wonderful for them. The ability for them to move and make the change, knowing their students and knowing what they need to read and knowing how they can express themselves has been instrumental in bringing forward for really positive changes in understanding, and especially the idea of the mirrors and windows. I'm not even gonna use all my time.
Thank you, Sandra. Next up is Julie Garaham, and after her is Mike Arata.
Hi, my name's Julie Garahan. I'm a teacher librarian over at Windermere Ranch, but I'm also a mother of 2 children. One of them was a reader from time she was born. One of them became a reader in high school because that's when the material got good for him. That's when he connected. So I think just like we hear, all children will learn, but not all children will learn the same thing on the same day. Books are out there. Not every kid will connect with the same book, but every kid will connect with a book. We just have to find the right one. Right now I'm in the middle of the refugee unit where the kids are reading 20 different novels and they're getting together and discussing their refugees experience. And I asked the kids how many people are enjoying their novel, and 90% of them said yes. I said, how many of you would read this novel if it wasn't part of this unit? 0 said they would have picked up that novel. So books are a way of us expanding that kid's understanding of the world. And I asked them, do you feel more prepared for the world? What we're talking about right now with the election, with things going on in the world, with current events. And they all said that these are books that were helping them understand the world. So that's it.
Thank you, Julie. Next up is Mike Arata, and after Mike Arata is Mac Farah.
Unfortunately, your personnel routinely violate existing policies and regulations affecting classroom and library materials. Policy 6161.1, for example, under discussion today, echoes policy 410. Among other restrictions, both forbid discrimination based on race. Instead, your administrators and teachers, advised by grossly overpaid consultants, brainwash students with a prejudicial oppressor-victim white supremacy version of race relations. Even your adopted textbooks do that. For example, this book is anti-racist, capitalizes every race but white, and tells 7th graders that it's okay to discriminate against white people. Stamped racism, anti-racism, and you misleads the same 7th graders on crime statistics and recommends NWA's vile Straight Outta Compton as a source of, quote, change and empowerment. NWA, by the way, stands for Niggas with Attitude, their own term. Policy 4219.24 says that displaying or transmitting sexual objects, pornography, pictures, or depictions to a student is prohibited. But your high school libraries routinely violate that prohibition with how-to sex manuals and many dozens of pornographic novels. And now the novels have begun contaminating your English classrooms. Material which advises sexting and paid visits to porn performer websites doesn't belong in schools, but it's here. Nor do dozens of novels which feature girls and women as insatiable sex objects and boys and men as ravenous exploiters of them. Yet you claim to foster social emotional well-being, even as you feed such depraved porn to district school kids. Were you a responsible board, you would direct your F3 attorneys, who are $4,000 contributors to the Measure E&F parcel tax campaign, by the way, to form a school coalition to challenge support for porn in schools by the Newsom-Bonta-Thurmond axis. Meanwhile, policy 6141.2 says that staff members shall be highly sensitive to their obligation not to interfere with the religious development of any student in whatever tradition the student embraces. Instead, as demonstrated with everything from LGBTQ read-alouds in kindergarten to pornographic material in high school libraries and classrooms, your activist teachers utilize material obviously at odds with major religious traditions, leaving students and parents either to go along or to face ostracism when they courageously object. Finally, the district should stop merely pretending that it regards parents as partners and begin actually to behave consistently with that claim and with Federal Code US 20, Section 3401, recognizing that parents are the primary educators of their children and that states and schools are to support that parental role, not subvert it. If you did support parents, you wouldn't have a record of 0 rejections of books and films over 35 years.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is Mac Vera, and after Mac Vera is Isabella Grippa. Oh, no, Grima, sorry. It's my glasses.
I'm Mac Vera. I'm a senior at California High School. I've been going to these board meetings as a driver for my friends, and I've listened to both arguments for keeping and getting rid of books in our libraries, and this is my personal opinion. For those who want to remove books from our libraries, I can see where you're coming from, where you want to protect your students, but at the same time, while trying to protect your students, you're taking away other students' right to learn, basically, where you're getting rid of the options for students to choose their own book to read. An example of a book that I've read for a class that I dislike is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Even though I dislike this book and I understood it to a certain degree, I don't think it should be get rid of from our libraries because a lot of people like this book. My opinion is not one that should be causing the masses to lose a piece of literature. Sorry, I wrote this speech when I first heard about this board meeting, and it's been 3 months since. If you don't want your students to read a book, please have a discussion with us. Most of us don't mind talking with people. As long as you are stating your opinion, we'll listen. Because I know for me, I was taught to be respectful no matter who's speaking, even if I disagree with their opinion. So I'll listen. I'll try to see your point, but just at least have a conversation with us. We're trying to you expect us to be by the time we're 18, you expect us to be semi-independent and to go off to college and be alone for the first time. So have a conversation with us. That's all I'm asking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mac. Next up is Isabella Grima, and after Isabella is Kim Reisdorf.
Okay, is this working? Fabulous. Hi, I'm Bella Grima. I'm a senior at Cal High. I'm speaking on behalf of Cal students here today. I understand that there are many here today who claim to be working for the benefit of the future generation, and if that is true, then it seems we share the same goal. We students here today are the future generation, and we are here to advocate for our school staff, for our curriculum, and above all, for ourselves. All we students have ever advocated for is our right to choose how we express ourselves, not our right to force someone to participate in our, and I quote, LGBTQ propaganda, but simply our right to choose our own paths and to pursue what we are interested in. I've met wonderful, empathetic people at Cal who want nothing more than to support those around them. I'm referring to groups such as the Cal Restorative Justice Coalition, the Black Student Union, and the Gender Sexuality Alliance, who give students a space where they can freely identify. I'm talking about the majority of Cal's teachers and staff who support and advocate for diversity programs, curriculums, and events. And I'm talking about the Justice and Community Pathway, which has helped me to find my voice and helped me to foster empathy for underrepresented groups through reading and discussion. These teachers and these programs give voice to the students who feel silenced, and I will forever be thankful for that. There is power in a sense of belonging, and there is power in diversity. After all, we are surrounded by a diverse ecosystem made of billions of organisms that are responsible for the life-sustaining world we humans get to be a part of. Earth could not function if it only had one species of flower, so why should we humans be any different? What makes us think that we can prevent diversity, or even more to the point, why would we ever want to limit diversity when it is so obviously essential to life? We students come from all sorts of beliefs, classes, races, genders, and sexual orientations. My peers and I are products of this district, and we are the future policymakers, medical professionals, educators, and scientists of this country. We are the future. So why should our curriculums be restricted to one kind of book, one kind of experience, and one kind of identity? We need an education that values student input, and we need an education that reflects the diversity that's already in our schools and in our world, so that people like myself and the students of tomorrow can find themselves in their learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. Next up is Kim Reisdorf, and after Kim Reisdorf is Max Rosero.
Really appreciated being here in this discussion and hearing from teachers and students. It gives me hope for our future. I come as a community member who's a pastor and a college professor, and I would like to offer these things as well. Students have a lot of exposure to violence online, movies, theaters, and when books carefully curated by librarians and their teachers are allowed to explore that in a safe and serious way, we're talking about more than the book at hand. And it's needed, it's important. I also believe that every student should find themselves in a book. And when we tend to pull books that explore race, the history of racism in our nation, or the full inclusion of all people as they explore sexual orientation and gender identity, when we do that, I know we do harm. It's more than just being supportive, as your guidelines say. It's a lifeline. It's hope for the future. I know it can save lives. And finally, you may already know this, you may already have experienced this, but teenagers are interested in sex. And that's a good thing. And when we don't provide information on that, their interest doesn't go away. They turn to other sources that are harmful, that misinform and can do real harm. So I come hoping you'll stay with the recommendation that introduced this whole presentation, that your guidelines are solid. Yeah, tweak the thing about the 11 books, maybe the supplementary material, but as a community member and as someone who wants to support the future generations, what you're doing really matters in keeping the books on the shelves.
Thank you, Kim. Next up is Max Rosero, and after Max is Bob Allen.
Hi again. I'm Max. As usual, my friends are here with me to represent Cal High Voices. And personally, I want to advocate for more minimal restrictions on supplemental materials. Giving students and teachers more free choice can significantly bring a student closer to aligning with the learner profile as outlined by the district. Quoting directly from the slide thing, the ability to draw informed conclusions and listen with empathy to decipher meaning and intentions, that can be strengthened by mature and diverse student choice in independent reading, as demonstrated by my time in AP Lit. This year, I've written several essays about quote unquote spicy independent reading books, such as 100 Years of Solitude, Giovanni's Room. I also read and enjoyed Beloved by Toni Morrison. And my writing skills have greatly improved from the experience. Furthermore, I think it's counterproductive to predetermine what perspectives and conclusions are best for students to be exposed to. By letting specific communities members, most vocal and biased and frankly conservative opinions push one standard as to what is or isn't allowed in our libraries, we're encouraging one homogeneous and closed-minded perspective. As stated in AR 6161.1, the district aims to include materials of all levels of difficulty with appeal to students of varied interests, abilities, and developmental levels. And this means trusting students with books that might challenge the moral, political, or religious ideals that their parents taught them. This challenge is healthy and should be encouraged. When parents and community members protest the pornography and propaganda, how can we be sure that they're not just blinded by their own biases? I question whether or not these community members are actually trying to be adaptable learners and effective communicators themselves, what with their repetitive signage. And I question whether they're actually trying to read the new material, trying to listen with empathy to decipher the actual meaning of the text, or whether they walk through the library halls with one goal, to find the raunchiest scenes that the young adult section has to offer, only to act shocked when they find sex and violence. If you only ever look for sex and violence, that's all you'll ever find. And no one else is to blame for that. Not the authors of the books, not the teachers or librarians or students. And yeah, I hope you'll continue to take my words into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. And then we have Mike Arata and, I'm sorry, Bob Allen. And that's our last one. Sorry. It's been a really long day for me. I'm sorry.
I know.
It has. Full day of work, long commute. Here I am.
You have a bunch of teachers and students who have done the same thing. So after all those amazing, wonderful talks, I'm up here with this horrible closing. And I'm just want to respond to the examples brought up for notification policies. One example was Chino Hills. And I know you were providing a spectrum on those, but if my recommendation, if you want to take it into consideration, is try not to use Chino Hills. I understand they have other policies that are detrimental to students. That they have a policy that outs trans students to the parents. So that's my only concern. That was it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Bob. All right, so that was the last public comment. I don't know if anyone, I have a couple of thoughts, questions, maybe, I guess. So with this idea of twice a year, you know, having, and there's sense in that, right? It allows for time, having a calendar, having it be more comprehensive, that kind of thing. But I also wonder if there's a way to then include an alternative pathway for books that can be more responsive, one-off kind of, you know, proposals that where if there's, you know, a need in a specific class, maybe there's guardrails around it, maybe it's not, it can't be, I'm throwing stuff, maybe it's not an all classroom book, maybe it is you know, something that's going to be lit circle. I don't know. I think once we kind of if we decide to dig into that supplemental versus textbook approval, but I just worry that if we're, you know, I believe that our goal is to expand educational opportunities for our students. And with that mindset and with the strategic directions that we have, to then create some necessary but also rigid barriers to that expansion. So allowing a space for a teacher and a classroom to be more responsive in specific situations.
So I can start and then Debbie, you can jump in. Again, it goes back to the original question. There's legal requirements for what you must be involved in. And then there's your decision regarding what else you want to be involved in. If you wish to be involved in less that isn't legislated, we don't need to worry about responsive policy. The worry is you've got to decide what paradigm we're going to be working with, if I may. Because right now you approve certain things. A lot of what we're hearing about that is responsive doesn't necessarily fit into that bucket. And if you want to put more parameters around that bucket, then that is something that you have every right to direct. We would have to take that back. We would have to do a lot of collaborating to bring something to you. But I think the decision is, do you want to be involved in those types of materials? In terms of the whole group instruction, we can probably, it doesn't have to be 2. We can work collaboratively with the community around if it be 3. I wouldn't get caught up into those granular details right now. We're hearing the need to be responsive as well as to be appropriate and to involve you as necessary and as you would like to be. So that I think is the question you have to wrestle with.
Yeah, and I think I need some clarity. So because when I think of like tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, that my understanding is that was a lit circle type of book, but because they had to buy more than 11, it came to us for approval. So a book like that, which perhaps I'm making an assumption might have been a book that a staff member wanted to bring because it's fairly new, it's interesting to students, and it might be, you know, something that reflects that specific cohort of students. but yet it still had to come to the board. So when you're saying, so that's where it's like, if we're following the current process that we have now, then those types of books are coming to us for approval and there's a whole process.
Again, if I could just add one more piece. That particular number that I inherited never made any sense to me. To go back to trustee Hurd's comment around, if you want to clarify parameters around how it's used, and then you ask us to stay within that, it can be revisited by saying, if the purpose of the book is, or the text is, or the resource is ABC, then it belongs within your purview. If the purpose is D, E, and F, then as long as these already existing in policy requirements around age appropriate, et cetera, understanding that that's not a easy, always, it's not always easy to sort out, then we could take, if that's the direction the board gives at a board meeting, we can take that and do some work with that and bring some language back to you that addresses that piece that we've been following, but actually isn't in policy right now, even though it seems to have been lost inadvertently. We could take that direction, do some work with the community and bring something back to you.
And it sounds like that would help because then you wouldn't have to have these 2 timeframes to make your lives easier. It would also address what Gary Knapp said about ambiguity and clarity and all that. One thing I would maybe like to add though into the process is that maybe when we're purchasing books, there's just a short rationale of how this adds to, we used a term a little while ago that now is escaping me, but the educational value. And then when we do get criticisms about particular things, it would be right there when you pull it up in the catalog about this book, if this is the value that this brings, whether it's windows and mirrors, whether it's the writing technique, whether it whatever. And I just think it would add to the richness of our library canon, whatever isn't the right word, but just what our students have access to, because it brings a purpose into it. And then with regard to what Jesse was suggesting, I would like to see more there. I think we are loud and clear. We don't want to make things harder, but the things that you suggested about helping to protect people, I think were interesting, but I want to hear more. Or look at examples.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not,
examples.
I'm not gonna pretend to be the expert on 61, 61, 11, but some of the things I saw, like, so I think if there can be that, there's a lot of flexibility on it, but there's some guardrails that like, hey, when it goes into here, because one thing we heard a lot about is the diversity of our students and all these sort of things and voice and choice. And those coins have a flip side. We have diversity of students where some of these things, it might not be the best for them. And voice and choice. They want to read a book, and there's other students who I wonder sometimes, because we had one that recently came up, an example of started reading the book and then realized after I got through this part, this was not the book for me. And I don't know the answer to that. And like I said, I don't want these to be so granular policies that it just infuriates everybody, or the board's constantly being pulled in to adjudicate individual books. Like, that's not what I want to do. I don't want to speak for you guys. I don't think it's what you want to do. But I do think that there's those tensions that we have to hold in place. And actually, one of the students that spoke, he said something that just, it struck me, was this concept, I can see why. And I think that that's a really interesting thing to look at, because as I approached this and thought through it a lot and thinking about serving this entire community, the first research I did is, let me see why you would never want to censor or ban or limit, to understand like kind of maybe something that's not exactly what you see. So trying to understand both sides is, okay, let me see why this and let me see why this. And then what is a policy that's never going to be perfect, but can we get a good policy that holds certain things in tension? Parent transparency and communication, student voice and choice, and honoring the academic expert. I don't know ultimately what that looks like. I'd be curious in seeing, can we incrementally get a little bit better of a policy, especially with the supplemental stuff. That seems to be a little like it's just an undefined policy right now at this point.
If I may, if you would just bear with me for a minute, as the conversation was going, I mean, one of the other things, instead of talking about approval of books, right, in the supplemental side, which is the problem, if that's what we are trying to solve. I mean, what if the district, from what I understand, book circles, lit circles are by choice. These are not mandatory things. And maybe the solution is letting parents know ahead of time that you're going to read books that have a mature content. And that's the choice that parents exercise at that moment to opt out of a lit circle for their kid. It's not about a book-driven discussion. It's a content-based discussion that is much broader. And it maintains everybody's individual choice. Instead of a book issue,
No,
this is just thinking out aloud instead of adopting a different policy or adopting every supplemental material that a teacher wants to use in a classroom, and to maintain the fluidity of what we just heard from the educators. I mean, I don't know, maybe giving parent notification ahead of time that there might be some mature content might be another way to think about it.
But then would the student be opting out of that whole unit? Because I don't see that as being practical. Whereas what we're trying to do is give them an alternative that, right?
I'm merely talking about books.
Right,
I'm,
okay.
so I don't think they opt out of the unit. I think they get a board approved book.
I think part of what Namita is saying is that best practice, if I can go back to what Deb was saying, and I think our educators would suggest the same, because I'm an English teacher, so I'm going to speak from experience now. You make certain choices regarding what the whole class is going to engage in for all kinds of different educational reasons. And frankly, it's our job to know our class, understand what they need, and be careful and aware of sensitivities that might exist when saying everyone is going to do this. And then there's lots of opportunities to educate where there's some choice. And that's where our deep learning movement is even going further. And that's where kids don't necessarily have to pick this text. They can pick that or this resource or this reading, what have you. And again, if I can push it one step further, because I think it's important, and I said it before, I'll say it again, and I know we heard about textbooks and such. The world is changing. Textbooks are obsolete the minute they're written. So we're going to have to shift our thinking, because I love our educators, but in this district, we are very attached to texts. That's not a bad thing. It's just our cultural experience as the world is galloping in front of us, and we've got to figure out a way to deal with this. So part of what I want to also share is I'm asking that we don't put policy in place when the world is galloping here, and we better teach people to be responsible. Our teachers support them to be appropriate, which I trust they are, and our parents to engage with us. I don't know how to put that into writing. But all I would suggest from the superintendent's point of view is if anything starts holding our feet in a way in the paradigm that may be now, it makes absolutely no sense in the world that our kids are actually spending most of their time in. And that's why, again, we referred to textbooks before. That's soon, in my opinion, going to be something that's not going to exist anymore, because it will not make any sense to exist in an AI world. It will not make any sense. So whatever you need to do for today is one thing. And all I'm suggesting is keeping an eye on not tomorrow, but today too, because it's already here.
No, sorry, go ahead.
So for me, I think it's important to have the communication, the transparency with parents for sure. And so I like the idea of making sure that we inform them ahead of time of when there's going to be mature content or whatever content in a book that might be objectionable. And I would leave that probably up to our teachers. What's important to me is student choice is number one. And number two is our educators are trained. I trust them, and I want them to have autonomy in their work. So I'm open to looking at the supplementary materials. I just don't want to handcuff our educators in the way that they do their job and what they deliver to our students. That's most important to me. And of course, parents have the final say on what their students are reading and all of that. And we need to be able to find a way to be transparent and to communicate specifically and directly with them so that they know what is happening in their students' world. But as far as the rest of the policy is concerned, I think that we are in a fairly solid place. And I think we have some work to do on some of the tightening up of some of the areas. But when I talk to the teacher librarians and I talk to students, they talk to me about student choice and about preparing our students who are at the secondary level, who are seniors in high school, for when they go to college and what they're going to be dealing with in their life. And it's so important to make the distinction about any given book and the content of it being discussed in a classroom with a teacher who's knowledgeable and is proficient in their profession is completely different than having a student just read a book by themselves and having no input from anybody else. It changes everything because it enables the students to be able to flesh out and to be able to discuss and to have someone there who can give input to them. So that's why taking a book on face value, just looking at it or looking at some of the content in it and saying that's a bad book, kids shouldn't be reading it. There's way more to it than that. So, I mean, I'm open to doing more work around this to make sure that we have everything in place, but I do not want to handcuff our educators.
Yeah, and sometimes I would agree on that, but also to be clear is to be kind. And so if we do have a open, broad approach that respects the teacher's profession and their expertise, and I've kind of said this from the beginning since I started, is it's one thing if a parent comes to me and says, didn't know my kid was reading this. It was assigned to them. They were told they had to read it. I didn't know until X, Y, and Z, and then I found out, and then I blew up. That's one thing. But if it's like, yeah, it was on the syllabus, they communicated to us, and then I just didn't look into it, but then I realized I had this content in it. I'm like, we talk, there's a common phrase that's thrown around a lot lately, parents' rights, right? I also think the flip side of that is parent responsibility. And we can provide them the right to be responsible by communication, but there's also that responsibility. If we've provided the communication, the ball's in your court, parent. And so I think that's another tension push pull thing of, what can we do as a district? We can communicate, we can be transparent, we can use our teacher guidance and expertise to say, hey, I'd really like to read this because here's the educational value that I want in it. I think at the end of the day, there's gonna be so few instances where if we can handle it beforehand, it's a lot easier conversation for the teacher, the parent, the student, the principal, the superintendent, the district office. When we're being reactionary, it gets uglier. And so how do we create a policy where it's like, here's some guidelines, here's the latitude though, big latitude to use your expertise. Here's some communication standards on syllabus. And like, even we were talking about 300 or 253 books on a master reading list for Lit Circle. I get the process that we would have to go through as a board just to do that one list. That's immense. But if the parents receive an email that says, here's a list of the books that the students could choose from in these Lit Circles, that you've communicated, and what does that communication look like? So yeah, those are just like, I'm actually just thinking out loud, but there's been a lot of internal, processing of this of like, well, what does good look like? What does good look like in this district?
So are you kind of suggesting that maybe where you're getting at with a supplementary policy would be really around communication guidelines, and maybe it's not, here's the 273 books that we
Yeah.
might get to
Yeah.
pick from.
But here's the
It's
ones
for this
I intend to
unit,
use,
you're
yeah.
gonna have a choice of these 10
Yeah.
or 20 or whatever is realistic. And then maybe that's part of how you thread the needle.
I'm doing some eye contact with Debbie because I think this is where things are getting confusing again. That makes sense when the whole class is being assigned something. That makes less sense when you're listening to the responsive conversation that you heard today. So in other words, if kids have choice, that's very different than the teacher saying, we're all going to read X book.
I was getting at the whole group, I think that's.
Yeah.
Talking about the lit circles. Now, there was the example that Debbie shared. Everything. That. I think you were talking about, and I was talking about. Where it's as for kids to read.
There's a finite list of books you can pick from. Yeah.
Not sure. Well, you know what? This is a board meeting conversation if you want a different direction. So what we're hearing right now is you may want something with supplemental and you may want something with the purpose in the 11. So that would be something you can think about and then bring to a board meeting to give direction. And then keeping in mind that anything that impacts our educators' practice is potentially negotiable. And so it doesn't necessarily become policy just because we do it here. We would also have to do some work there. But I would invite you to think about with a little bit more clarity what the operationalizing of what you just said would look like, because we've gone round and round and round and we don't have it yet. So if you have some clarity in your thinking based upon tonight's conversation, that in the board meeting, you could say, team, we'd like you to engage parents and students and staff around these questions, and you give us a direction to do that, which would be an action item, then we would go and figure out with all of our partners how to get feedback for you on whatever it is you would like us to potentially incorporate. So the invitation would be, think about the areas that you think might need to be adjusted, shifted, added. Think about then how you might want us to go and get that information for you and then vote on that at an action item in the board meeting. And then I think we can do what you ask us to do.
And I think we were all kind of hitting that framing the whole thing about getting rid of this 11 thing.
Yes, yeah. I was actually gonna say, for me, I don't necessarily need a specific policy around supplemental materials and stuff. If we get rid of the 11 or whatever, and then implement it like this is the purpose, right? Specific purpose for, whatever.
But I think
books
I think
and
what
stuff.
some of us are focusing on is the concept of partnership with families, not looking for a parental rights and I get to veto anything, but the communication we used to get when our kids were in elementary school, we're starting the butterfly unit and blah, blah, we're just communicating. We're not looking for a vote. We're not looking for approval. We're just sharing. Now, maybe that gets ridiculous. Carrie's laughing at me over there. So I'm going to acknowledge that. I think Christine is too. So it's not that, but Jesse has brought to us a concern that some of his constituents have brought to him. And I'm just saying, I think it's fair. And I think Shelley, you talked about it too, is leaning into what could that look like? Not looking for veto policy, but just what could it look like? And maybe that's the next step of we've kind of expressed what could that look like? And now staff, what could that look like? And I'm sure you have some teacher librarians that would have a lot of input and also English teachers that would have a lot. And we're not looking at causing a fight.
Yeah.
We're trying to build back some of
De-escalate.
this amazing
Yeah.
two-way partnership that we've always
Okay,
had.
well,
that
I'd
was
like
never-
to kind of
never
continue
like
with my
since-
comments.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I think transparency with parents, very, very important. But I also want to balance that with like, oh, well, notification, like you said, right? Like, hey, parents, this is like all the books. And that, especially since we're talking about high school, okay, difference in terms of elementary, maybe middle in there, but high school. I think that there definitely needs to be transparency and communication with parents, but we all know that high school students also, I think that we should give them some credit and that they will discuss with their parents. Maybe not, right? Maybe like Jesse said, they'll start reading and like, oh, like our student, I don't like this. Well, they don't like it. Okay, they don't have to continue reading with, that book or even other. They could start talking with teacher. I think that, again, our strategic directions, our learner profile is to be critical thinkers, right? Learn, practice that. Become effective communicators. How effective, like to practice, like go to your teacher, tell them you're not, instead of just reading it and saying, I don't like it, talk to your teacher. Talk to, say you don't feel comfortable or you don't like it or you don't understand, and have them give you alternative choice. Talk to your parents and say, hey, this is what, and hopefully the teacher, that will get the teacher to work with the parents, because the teacher and the parents, of course, know their student, what their sensitivity is, right? Maybe the teacher can, instead of like, broadcast, like these are the texts that have, like specific explicit sex or whatever. It's more like just, well, again, going to that, what is the educational value? And then if they know their student is going to be very sensitive about this, or maybe even a parent who might be a little more sensitive about it, they can work together with that. So I'm seeing that as kind of more a nuance than like, oh, let's put in a policy. Because then that might not only curtail, right, like the expertise and the freedom of our teachers, but also just it just applies to like a whole swath of students when we actually need a little bit more of the customized one-on-one area. That's how I'm seeing.
And I do want to add, Rachel, that what I would need from you at the board meeting is not to give this back to cabinet. And the reason I'm saying that is not because we don't like a challenge. We understand the issues in the community, and we have spent hours trying to figure out a strategy that marries our kids first, our teachers and staff members and expertise, and our parent partnership. But there's one challenge to this whole conversation. We don't all agree on what is sensitive. We don't all agree on what is offensive. It's obvious because this topic brings more energy into this room than anything. And as an educator, our educators do need protection. But what's been happening for the most part is that what Susanna says happens. Educators share what they're going to be doing. Some parents share that they are uncomfortable. Our teachers are making different decisions under individual circumstances often. And then there are some that feel that you need to put more safeguards in, which is your prerogative. What I'm saying to you is we've tried to figure out how to balance these things in writing, and we have not been able to come up with anything after hours of work. So what I would need from you is to give us a direction to engage community on what they'd like to see. My bet is you would see diversity like we've been hearing each time, which makes this so complicated. However, I've always learned something through engagement. There may be something that emerges that actually is, that's it. That's the balance that could work, because everybody wants to bring everyone around the table for this. This is not an interest to divide. But what we're sharing with you is if you just said to us at the next board meeting, could you take this and bring back to us A, B, and C? I'm already telling you that it has been hours of attempts.
Well, and can I ask, so to Susanna's point, instead of looking at the what, the books. This is the list of all the options that at some point, perhaps, maybe your student might pick off the shelf. And can you approve this, to a parent, like putting that onus on that. Instead of that, conveying the process. So, having in every syllabus, in everything, just a statement that says, your student will have an opportunity to choose these books, not these books, but books. They'll have, choice and voice. If you have a concern with the book that they bring home, let me know, that kind of thing. And then that can start that conversation. So there's an understanding of how a parent can have some control, but it's not just an assumption that we're going to give the parents all the information. We're going to take our time, give the parents all the information, so that then that 10% that's going to pay attention, because honestly, that's what it would be, then would pay attention and look through it. So it's more about the process that, I don't know.
So an example to that would be, then you would invite us to engage our union colleagues in a negotiated discussion around what might it mean to communicate differently. That would be your direction to us, and then we would go and do that, because I'm sure that that would be a great place for us to gain insight into what might work. And then we bring what we learn back to you as one of the partners. So with anything that you might want to gain more information about, my invitation would be, my thought would be, put it on the board meeting agenda as an action item. Think about the things you would want to gain more insights around, and then focus what you ask us to do, which would obviously have to move into next year, where we engage our union colleagues on this, our parent community on that, our students on this, and we can devise that. But you just got to give us the topics for, I want to know more about how we could do this better, or how we could improve upon this. You don't have to actually devise the engagement strategy. And then what we can do is take that direction, and then we could talk to a lot of people and bring back to you. Our advice would be that we do the following things to gain the information and the insights that you need.
So a couple last points based on kind of the dialogue. Sometimes we get criticized as a district on being too myopic on high school. And I think that's happening right here. We're talking about near adults who have more volition and more power and more understanding. And what we're losing sight of is, can the 7-year-old come home and communicate to mom and dad anything of what's going on in the book? No, we look more for parental involvement. It is one of those roles that we work our way out of as they get older. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Also, I think books gets really there's visceral emotions around it on all sides. And the supplemental educational policies don't just cover books. It covers video clips, it covers YouTube clips, it covers some of these things that are a little bit more leaning into. And to provide, yes, this is okay. However, in these small instances, graphic violence, graphic sexuality, these sort of things, or if it has a rating that falls outside of that age group, the MPAA, which, if you're looking at a TV clip, it's not MPPA or MPAA rated, but it might be TV 14 or whatever. So again, I don't want a granular policy that takes up 10 pages, but can there be at least somewhere to start to go, hey, we think this is a good first step towards exploring this and understanding that we have a TK through 12 district.
Yeah, no, definitely. I actually think that a 7-year-old would probably take something and share with their parents. I think that maybe a middle schooler might not, but yes, we would need to think about, consider, yes, the whole TK to 12.
So just oh, sorry, go ahead. No, you go.
I just wanted to say that I think it's really hard to make these decisions in this kind of climate, because it's hard not to be influenced by the political winds that go one way or the other. And I just want to put it out there that I want us to be cognizant of the fact that yes, there are people in the community that don't agree with certain things that we're doing or our policy or having a lot of student choice or whatever, but I want to make my decision based on what's the best for students, not on because we're being ridiculed by certain groups or certain people continually that we're going to change our policies or I mean, there's nothing wrong with looking at the functionality and the communication structure of our policies. We've looked at a lot of them and changed a lot of them and improved them, and that's good. But I just think this is so highly charged that for me, I want to make sure that I don't make those decisions based on what I perceive as being actually the minority voice in this community. It's very loud, and I know some of us hear from them more than others, but it's important to me that those policies serve our students and honor our educators.
If I can say something that's an educator comment and not an emotional one, it's just operational. I'm a third grade teacher with 28 kids. I know my parents. I know my kids, and there's a process that they can come and see me about anything that I'm doing. I communicate a lot of things that I'm going to use. And there may be times when responsively, under a circumstance, I make some curricular decisions. If I'm an educator in that third grade classroom and there's policy that might cause me to have to ask my 30 parents if this is okay, each time that it maybe crosses whatever line you give us, which is the part I said is difficult, that makes an educator's job exceptionally difficult. That's the part that I'm saying. This is not about emotion right now. It's simply, I got 30 kids, I got 30 families. I know my families and I want them to approach me. And when a parent says I can't approach that teacher, we have process around that. We support the principal. Our supervisors support the principal. So again, what I'm saying is I'm totally sensitive to the fact that some of our materials make some of our families uncomfortable. Good process means that there's ways to work through that. Just Shelley's point, I have no ability to know how big a problem we have. I don't know out of 30,000 families, but I'm simply saying a teacher being asked to do some of the things we're talking about, I think is almost impossible. So all I'm asking you to do is you're thinking about what you might ask of us. I'm not trying to say what I just said that parents aren't important. I'm simply saying education can't just be we can pick and choose each day depending upon what the resources are and the materials are. When you're talking 30 kids in an elementary classroom, you're talking 180 in a secondary classroom, because I don't know how you'd operate.
And the only thing I would add to that is yet there's dozens of districts in California that have supplemental policies. So.
And we could put one in place, but there's lots of supplemental policies that provide very important high-level guardrails that in no way speaks to when it moves to this content area, you should do X. It might say, consider age appropriate, like I've seen those policies as well. This isn't an anti-supplemental material policy, but going back to Navita's point, I've seen parameters like this, and I've seen parameters like that.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that we're moving towards this, my educator opinion is you can't teach easily and effectively in that. But yes, there's a lot of supplemental material policies that I perfectly love, but they may not actually meet the need of some of the community members who've reached out to me who have the greatest upset by what's going on here. That's my only concern.
And if I may add, I mean, the policy may not be the panacea. I mean, it may just be that we are looking at our own ARs, the regulations and utilization of the current process that we use to perhaps put that in our AR so that people know that there is a process, there's a uniform process that the district uses site-wide, district-wide.
That was
Every
kind of what I was getting at. We were communicating, how does this work? And then if someone has a question, they now know this is how it works. And if I have a problem with that, this is who I go talk to.
Yeah.
I only think
It's really
the problem with that is, sometimes the process is the punishment. And so for the parent that's sitting there and they're like, I did not like how this went through. I have to meet with a teacher. And then after we don't resolve that, then we meet with teacher and principal. And then after that, we meet with teacher, principal, Deb Pettish. And then after that, if I still don't like it, it's this escalating thing that we don't want to appear as though it's a punitive process for your voice to be heard. But I don't disagree with this conversation. I don't want to overstep and over policy our district, but I do see this like this hole that's there. And when a parent approaches me and says, how does this work? I don't want that answer to always be the only recourse you have is to follow this 3-step or 4-step policy and then bring it before the board. And then we evaluate if we followed our policy. Like it to me, and I'll just speak for me, it feels like there's some work to do holding that tension of, we don't want to overstep this. How do we provide transparency and communication, student voice, basically our strategic directions? I feel like this policy, when you compare it to our strategic directions, there's a couple small little gaps in there.
So in that process, though, my understanding, so when I think about what was on our agenda around the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian, the process that I understood it was that the parents went to the teacher and the teacher changed the book for the student, but that wasn't quite what the parents wanted. They went to the principal, rose all the way up to the board. And ultimately that was to remove that book for all students. So that process, from my standpoint, that process is actually opportunity for communication, for conversation, for reconciliation, for compromise. And in that situation, it wasn't what the parents wanted. And so that's why it rose to that. But ultimately, that was from what I understand, that was the first time that process went all the way through to the 5 steps. So I would actually argue that process is not so much of a burden on the parents, but having a educator due to what Dr. Malloy mentioned, that is a outsized burden for that lack of, or for that inability to have that process that actually has benefit.
But you could almost argue that process should have stopped right after the beginning, because according to that other law, we don't ban books.
Right,
So we can't ban books. So
right.
end, stop, process exhausted.
I
Why
think-
did it even come to us?
If I can offer another suggestion, because I'm hearing 2 things that we could engage the community on. How do we communicate most effectively? And then how do we deal with that arbitrary number thing, which doesn't make a lot of sense?
Yeah.
If at the board meeting, you asked us to go and engage on those 2, well, the one we don't need to engage on, it's just
The
this
11
number.
yeah.
That actually cabinet has a lot of ideas around. I'm not worried about that. That's actually not as politically, emotionally
Right.
laden. But how do we communicate more effectively? That would probably take a little, not more effectively, most effectively, because I do believe we do a lot of effective things out there. That's something we could talk to our staff about, our union colleagues about, our parents about, our students about. And maybe there are some strategies that can be employed that we all agree to that might just help this situation without making it more difficult in its operation than it needs to be. But that may be where good ideas emerge on what does most effective communication regarding the resources we use look like and sound like. It may even mean how teachers approach their, curriculum nights and such, conversations that they have. I mean, I'm not
That's
gonna.
exactly what I was talking
Right,
about.
right,
I think I misspoke, or I got misinterpreted, but all I was talking about is, what are these lanes? And you don't like a supplemental material, fine, have this one or that one or that one. But we're not talking about getting rid of anything
No.
because it wasn't even in that category.
And my comments aren't implying that you were trying to get rid of anything. I'm just hearing the conversation from the perspective of an educator without wanting to ignore the voice of the parent and thinking, oh my goodness, I have 30 kids. This is sounding really overwhelming. But if we go back to you asking us to engage around what does effective communication around the use of texts and resources look like, we can get some, maybe some ideas will rise to the top that we just need to do 2 or 3 things that haven't been done systemically. They may be done in places that would help this conversation. That's what I'm proposing.
Yeah, yeah. Can I ask, when we're talking about next steps, so because the looking at the 11, the mysterious 11 number. So 11's not currently in the policy. So, but we would want to look at shifting, do we need to do anything with that policy if that's not in there? And we're just looking at, you guys are just looking at process as to how you would then define the purpose type of thing?
I would like to add that process to the policy. That would be my preference.
So, yeah, so I would suggest that we have that on an agenda item in a coming meeting. And then,
And we can do that just by consensus right now, saying, yes, please put that on that upcoming.
oh, we
meeting,
can
right?
with, oh, yes, on the agenda.
Because that
yeah.
was your second option. One of us could ask Laura, or
Or
we
you
could
just-
all just
Yes,
say, hey, we
yeah,
want to do
yeah,
this.
And then to the point of the, what you just talked about, communication, that type of thing. Is that something then that we want to bring also to the next meeting to ask for an action of staff?
Because, let me ask our legal counsel on this, because you're just asking us to do some engagement around effective communication.
That doesn't.
That's not a
okay.
direction that I think is all that politically laden, so I would feel comfortable receiving that as a consensus without it being on the agenda, but I'm asking.
I completely agree. Yeah, you're asking for more information, basically. So it's an information gathering thing. We'll bring it to the board at the next board meeting, and then you can give us direction as to which way you want us to proceed.
Okay, does that?
Yeah, and the only thing I'd throw back in on the 61.11, the supplemental policy, there's a lot of just baseline legal protections on there too that don't get into these emotional issues of like, don't break copyright law, don't do this. Like some general legal parameters that I think it's smart to at least have a policy, whether that's CSBA or CSBA plus, like some small nuances. That's my personal opinion and desire, because I think it is a whole, and we do refer to it on a lot of different policies. And I know we kind of explained that, hey, that's just a cross-reference or of a CSBA policy number, but that's another thing that we might want to think about too, is a little footnote disclaimer on our policy saying not all of these policies may or may not be adopted policies. So
And that we can do, but I think that particular request is one
Board
for a
action.
board meeting.
Uh-huh.
Because the addition of a supplemental materials policy, I know for a fact, is an item that I believe our community may want to speak to you about. So I don't think we should take that direction outside the board meeting.
So that looks like having on the agenda that we
Discussion.
are going to discuss, do we want a supplemental?
And
Perfect.
then if you do, then we then have to go do all the work, and that takes time, and we know how to do that.
Yeah.
But I think that you directing if you want one or not should be something that you give us direction where the community can come and tell you how they feel,
Totally agree.
should they want to.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I would agree with that too. So having those two on our next, or on whatever agenda, the one, okay, the
We
one.
can take the other two.
Because
Okay.
then there's an opportunity for whichever board member wants to ask for that in that meeting,
Yeah.
to explain their rationale about why.
Yeah, we won't have a presentation.
And-
You'll-
Oh, no, yeah.
And really what they're looking for. And it might be, it's overarching comments. It's not granular stuff.
And trustee Vanzi, just wanted to let you know, we have a separate use of copyright materials policy that the board already has adopted. It's 6162.6.
Okay, great. So
Just,
oh,
that was a really good point. I just went and looked at it.
thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Does anyone else have any other comments or questions or discussion, or are we good? All right.
Deb, thank you for all the prep you put into this. I think that was a really
thoughtful
good
conversation. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Namina, for being here
Oh, my pleasure.
and for all of the staff and students and everyone's voice. All right, meeting adjourned.